Human Nature and Conduct, An Introduction to Social Psychology, Part 3, by John Dewey, published in 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by William Jones. Section 1. Habit and Intelligence, including habits and intellect, mind, habit, and impulse. In discussing habit and impulse, we have repeatedly met topics where reference to the work of thought was imperative. Explicit consideration of the place and office of intelligence in conduct can hardly begin otherwise than by gathering together these incidental references and reaffirming their significance. The stimulation of reflective imagination by impulse, its dependence upon established habits, and its effect in transforming habit and regulating impulse forms, accordingly, our first theme. Habits are conditions of intellectual efficiency. They operate in two ways upon intellect. Obviously, they restrict its reach, and they fix its boundaries. They are blinders that confine the eyes of mind to the road ahead. They prevent thought from straying away from its imminent occupation to a landscape more varied and picturesque, but irrelevant to practice. Outside the scope of habits, thought works gropingly, fumbling in confused uncertainty, and yet habit, made complete in routine, shuts in thought so effectually that it is no longer needed or possible. The routine ear's road is a ditch out of which he cannot get, whose sides enclose him, directing his course so thoroughly that he no longer thinks of his path or his destination. All habit forming involves the beginning of an intellectual specialization, which, if unchecked, ends in thoughtless action. Significantly enough, this full-blown result is called absent-mindedness. Stimulus and response are mechanically linked together in an unbroken chain. Each successive act, facilely evoked by its predecessor, pushes us automatically into the next act of a predetermined series. Only a signal flag of distress recalls consciousness to the task of carrying on. Fortunately, nature, which beckons us to this path of least resistance, also puts obstacles in the way of our complete acceptance of its invitation. Success in achieving a ruthless and dull efficiency of action is thwarted by untoward circumstance. The most skillful aptitude bumps at times into the unexpected, and so gets into trouble from which only observation and invention can extricate it. Efficiency in following a beaten path has then to be converted into breaking a new road through strange lands. Nevertheless, what in effect is love of ease has masqueraded morally as love of perfection. A goal of finished accomplishment has been set up, which, if it were attained, would mean only mindless action. It has been called complete and free activity, when in truth it is only a treadmill activity, or marching in one place. The practical impossibility of reaching in an all-around way and all at once such a perfection has been recognized. But such a goal has nevertheless been conceived as the ideal, and progress has been defined as approximation to it. Under diverse intellectual skies, the ideal has assumed diverse forms and colors, but all of them have involved the conception of a completed activity, a static perfection. Desire and need have been treated as signs of deficiency, and endeavor as proof not of power, but of incompletion. In Aristotle, this conception of an end which exalts all realization and excludes all potentiality appears as a definition of the highest excellence. It, of necessity, excludes all want and struggle and all dependencies. It is neither practical nor social. Nothing is left but a self-revolving, self-sufficing thought engaged in contemplating its own sufficiency. Some forms of Oriental morals have united this logic with a profounder psychology and have seen that the final terminus of this road is nirvana, an obliteration of all thought and desire. In medieval science, the ideal reappeared as a definition of heavenly bliss accessible only to a redeemed immortal soul. Herbert Spencer is far enough away from Aristotle, medieval Christianity and Buddhism, but the idea reemerges in his conception of a goal of evolution in which adaptation of organism to environment is complete and final. In popular thought, the conception lives in the vague thought of a remote state of attainment in which we shall be beyond temptation, and in which virtue by its own inertia will persist as a triumphant consummation. Even Kant, who begins with a complete scorn for happiness, ends with an ideal of the eternal and undisturbed union of virtue and joy, though in his case nothing but a symbolic approximation is admitted to be feasible. The fallacy in these versions of the same idea is perhaps the most pervasive of all fallacies in philosophy. So common is it that one questions whether it might not be called the philosophical fallacy. It consists in the supposition that whatever is found true under certain conditions may forthwith be asserted universally or without limits and conditions. Because a thirsty man gets satisfaction in drinking water, bliss consists in being drowned. Because the success of any particular struggle is measured by reaching a point of frictionless action, therefore there is such a thing as an all-inclusive end of effortless, smooth activity endlessly maintained. It is forgotten that success is success of a specific effort, and satisfaction is the fulfillment of a specific demand, so that success and satisfaction become meaningless when severed from the wants and struggles whose consummations they are, or when taken universally. The philosophy of nirvana comes the closest to admission of this fact, but even it holds nirvana to be desirable. Habit is, however, more than a restriction of thought. Habits become negative limits because they are first positive agencies. The more numerous our habits, then the wider is the field of possible observation and foretelling. The more flexible they are, the more refined is perception in its discrimination, and the more delicate the presentation evoked by imagination. The sailor is intellectually at home on the sea, the hunter in the forest, the painter in his studio, and the man of science in his laboratory. These commonplaces are universally recognized in the concrete, but their significance is obscured and their truth denied in the current general theory of mind. For they mean nothing more or less than that habits formed in the process of exercising biological aptitudes are the sole agents of observation, recollection, foresight, and judgment. A mind or consciousness or soul in general which performs these operations is a myth. The doctrine of a single, simple, indissoluble soul was the cause and the effect of failure to recognize that concrete habits are the means of knowledge and thought. Many who think themselves scientifically emancipated, and who freely advertise the soul as a superstition, perpetuate a false notion of what knows, that is, of a separate knower. Nowadays, they usually fix upon consciousness in general as a stream or process or entity, or else, more specifically, upon sensations and images as the tools of intellect, or sometimes they think they have scaled the last heights of realism by adverting grandiosely to a formal knower in general who serves as one term in the knowing relation. By dismissing psychology as irrelevant to knowledge and logic, they think to conceal the psychological monster they have conjured up. Now it is dogmatically stated that no such conceptions of the seat, agent, or vehicle will go psychologically at the present time. Concrete habits do all the perceiving, recognizing, imagining, recalling, judging, conceiving, and reasoning that is done. Consciousness, whether as a stream or as special sensations and images, expresses functions of habits, phenomena of their formation, operation, their interruption, and reorganization. Yet habit does not of itself know, for it does not of itself stop to think, observe, or remember. Neither does impulse of itself engage in reflection or contemplation. It just lets go. Habits by themselves are too organized, too insistent, and determinate to need to indulge in inquiry or imagination. And impulses are too chaotic, tumultuous, and confused to be able to know even if they wanted to. Habit as such is too definitely adapted to an environment to survey or analyze it. And impulse is too indeterminately related to the environment to be capable of reporting anything about it. Habit incorporates, enacts, or overrides objects, but it does not know them. Impulse scatters and obliterates them with its restless stir. A certain delicate combination of habit and impulse is requisite for observation, memory, and judgment. Knowledge, which is not projected against the black unknown, lives in the muscles, not in consciousness. We may, indeed, be said to know how by means of our habits. And a sensible intimation of the practical function of knowledge has led men to identify all acquired practical skill, or even the instinct of animals, with knowledge. We walk and read aloud. We get off and on streetcars. We dress and undress and do 1,000 useful acts without thinking of them. We know something, namely, how to do them. Bergson's philosophy of intuition is hardly more than an elaborately documented commentary on the popular conception that by instinct a bird knows how to build a nest and a spider to weave a web. But after all, this practical work done by habit and instinct in securing prompt and exact adjustment to the environment, is not knowledge, except by courtesy. Or if we choose to call it knowledge, and no one has the right to issue a ukase to the contrary, then other things also called knowledge, knowledge of and about things, knowledge that things are thus and so, knowledge that involves reflection and conscious appreciation remains of a different sort, unaccounted for and undescribed. For it is a commonplace that the more suavely efficient a habit, the more unconsciously it operates. Only a hitch in its workings occasions emotion and provokes thought. Carlyle and Rousseau, hostile in temperament and outlook, yet agree in looking at consciousness as a kind of disease, since we have no consciousness of bodily or mental organs as long as they work at ease in perfect health. The idea of disease is, however, aside from the point, unless we are pessimistic enough to regard every slip in total adjustment of a person to its surroundings as something abnormal, a point of view which once more would identify well-being with perfect automatism. The truth is that in every waking moment, the complete balance of the organism and its environment is constantly interfered with and as constantly restored. Hence the stream of consciousness in general, and in particular that phase of it celebrated by William James as alternation of flights and perchings. Life is interruptions and recoveries. Continuous interruption is not possible in the activities of an individual. Absence of perfect equilibrium is not equivalent to a complete crushing of organized activity. When the disturbance amounts to such a pitch as that the self goes to pieces, it is like shell shock. Normally, the environment remains sufficiently in harmony with the body of organized activities to sustain most of them in active function. But a novel factor in these surroundings releases some impulse which tends to initiate a different and incompatible activity, to bring about a redistribution of the elements of organized activity between those have been respectively central and subsidiary. Thus the guided hand by the eye moves toward a surface. Visual quality is the dominant element. The hand comes in contact with an object. The eye does not cease to operate, but some unexpected quality of touch, a voluptuous smoothness or annoying heat, compels a readjustment in which the touching, handling activity strives to dominate the action. Now at these moments of a shifting in activity, conscious feeling and thought arise and are accentuated. The disturbed adjustment of an organism and environment is reflected in a temporary strife which concludes in a coming to terms of the old habit and the new impulse. In this period of redistribution, impulse determines the direction of movement. It furnishes the focus about which reorganization swirls. Our attention, in short, is always directed forward to bring to notice something which is imminent but which as yet escapes us. Impulse defines the peering, the search, the inquiry. It is, in logical language, the movement into the unknown, not into the immense inane of the unknown at large, but to that special unknown, which, when it is hit upon, restores an ordered, unified action. During this search, old habit supplies content, filling definite and recognizable subject matter. It begins as vague presentiment of what we are going towards. As organized habits are definitely deployed and focused, the confused situation takes on form. It is cleared up. the essential function of intelligence. Processes become objects. Without habit, there is only irritation and confused hesitation. With habit alone, there is a machine-like repetition, a duplicating reoccurrence of old acts. With conflict of habits and release of impulse, there is conscious search. End of Part 3, Section 1, The Place of Intelligence in Conduct. Read by William Jones. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 3, Section 2. The Psychology of Thinking. The Trinity of Intellect, Conscience, and its alleged separate subject matter. This LibriVox recording, read by William Jones, is in the public domain. We are going far afield from any direct moral issue. But the problem of the place of knowledge and judgment in conduct depends upon getting the fundamental psychology of thought straightened out. So, the excursion must be continued. We compare life to a traveler faring forth. We may consider him first at a moment where his activity is confident, straightforward, and organized. He marches on, giving no direct attention to his path, nor thinking of his destination. Abruptly he is pulled up, arrested. Something is going wrong in his activity. From the standpoint of an onlooker, he has met an obstacle which must be overcome before his behavior can be unified into a successful ongoing. From his own viewpoint, there is shock, confusion, perturbation, and uncertainty. For the moment he doesn't know what hit him, as we say, nor where he is going. But a new impulse is stirred, which becomes the starting point of an investigation, a looking into things, a trying to see them, to find out what is going on. Habits, which are interfered with, begin to get a new direction as they cluster about the impulse to look and see. The blocked habits of locomotion give him a sense of where he was going, of what he had set out to do, and of the ground already traversed. As he looks, he sees definite things which are not just things at large, but which are related to his course of action. The momentum of the activity entered upon persists as a sense of direction, of aim. It is an anticipatory project. In short, he recollects, observes, and plans. The trinity of these forecasts, perceptions, and remembrances form a subject matter of discriminated and identified objects. These objects represent habits turned inside out. They exhibit both the onward tendency of habit and the objective conditions which have been incorporated within it. Sensations in immediate consciousness are elements of action dislocated through the shock of interruption. They never, however, completely monopolize the scene, for there is a body of residual undisturbed habits which is reflected in remembered and perceived objects having a meaning. Thus, out of shock and puzzlement, there gradually emerges a figured framework of objects, past, present, and future. These shade off variously into a vast penumbra of vague, unfigured things, a setting which is taken for granted and not at all explicitly presented. The complexity of the figured scene in its scope and refinement of contents depends wholly upon prior habits and their organization. The reason a baby can know little and an experienced adult know much when confronting the same things is not because the latter has a mind which the former has not, but because one has already formed habits which the other has still to acquire. The scientific man and the philosopher, like the carpenter, the physician, and politician, know with their habits, not with their consciousness. The latter is eventual, not a source. Its occurrence marks a peculiarly delicate connection between highly organized habits and unorganized impulses. Its contents, or objects observed, recollected, projected, and generalized into principles, represent the incorporated material of habits coming to the surface, because habits are disintegrating at the touch of conflicting impulses. But they also gather themselves together to comprehend impulse and make it effective. This account is more or less strange as psychology, but certain aspects of it are commonplaces in a static logical formulation. It is, for example, almost a truism that knowledge is both synthetic and analytic, a set of discriminated elements connected by relations. This combination of opposite factors of unity and difference, and elements and relations, has been a standing paradox and mystery of the theory of knowledge. It will remain so until we connect the theory of knowledge with an empirically verifiable theory of behavior. The steps of this connection have been sketched, and we may enumerate them. We know at such times as habits are impeded, when a conflict is set up in which impulse is released. So far as this impulse sets up a definite forward tendency, it constitutes the forward, prospective character of knowledge. In this phase, unity or synthesis is found. We are striving to unify our responses to achieve a consistent environment which will restore unity of conduct. Unity and relations are prospective. They mark out lines converging to a focus. They are ideal. But what we know, the objects that present themselves with definiteness and assurance, are retrospective. They are the conditions which have been mastered and incorporated in the past. They are elements discriminated and analytic just because old habits, so far as they are checked, are also broken into objects which define the obstruction of ongoing activity. They are real, not ideal. Unity is something sought. Split or division is something given at hand. Were we to carry the same psychology into detail, we should come upon the explanation of perceived particulars and conceived universals, of the relation of discovery and proof, induction and deduction, the discrete and the continuous. Anything approaching an adequate discussion is too technical to be here in place. But the main point, however technical and abstract it may be in statement, is of far-reaching importance for everything concerned with moral beliefs, conscience, and judgments of right and wrong. The most general, if vaguest issue, concerns the nature of the organ of moral knowledge. As long as knowledge in general is thought to be the work of a special agent, whether soul, consciousness, intellect, or a knower in general, there is a logical propulsion toward postulating a special agent for knowledge of moral distinctions. Consciousness and conscience have more than a verbal connection. If the former is something in itself, a seat or power which antecedes intellectual functions, why should not the latter be also a unique faculty with its own separate jurisdiction? If reason in general is independent of empirically verifiable realities of human nature, such as instincts and organized habits, then why should there not also exist a moral or practical reason independent of natural operations? On the other hand, if it is recognized that knowing is carried on through the medium of natural factors, the assumption of special agencies for moral knowing becomes outlawed and incredible. Now, the matter of the existence or non-existence of such special agencies is no technically remote matter. The belief in a separate organ involves belief in a separate and independent subject matter. The question fundamentally at issue is nothing more or less than whether moral values, regulations, principles, and objects form a separate and independent domain, or whether they are part and parcel of a normal development of a life process. These considerations explain why the denial of a separate organ of knowledge, of a separate intellect or impulse toward knowing, is not the willful philistinism it is sometimes alleged to be. There is, of course, a sense in which there is a distinctive impulse, or rather habitual disposition, to know. But in the same sense, there is an impulse to aviate, to run a typewriter, or write stories for magazines. Some activities result in knowledge, others result in these other things. The result may be so important as to induce distinctive attention to the activities in order to foster them. From an incident, almost a byproduct, attainment of truth, physical, social, and moral, may become the leading characteristic of some activities. Under such circumstances, they become transformed. Knowing is then a distinctive activity with its own ends and its peculiarly adapted processes. All this is a matter of course. Having hit upon knowledge accidentally, as it were, and the product being liked and its importance noted, knowledge getting becomes, on occasion, a definite occupation. And education confirms the disposition, as it may confirm that of a musician or carpenter or tennis player. But there is no more an original separate impulse or power in one case than in the other. Every habit is impulsive, that is, projective and urgent, and the habit of knowing is no exception. The reason for insisting on this fact is not failure to appreciate the distinctive value of knowledge when once it comes into existence. This value is so immense it may be called unique. The aim of the discussion is not to subordinate knowing to some hard, prosaic, utilitarian end. The reason for insistence upon the derivative position of knowing in activity roots in a sense for fact, and in a realization that the doctrine of a separate original power and impulse of knowledge cuts knowledge off from other phases of human nature and results in its non-natural treatment. The isolation of intellectual disposition from concrete empirical facts of biological impulse and habit formation entails a denial of the continuity of mind with nature. Aristotle asserted that the faculty of pure knowing enters a man from without as through a door. Many since his day have asserted that knowing and doing have no intrinsic connection with one another. Reason is asserted to have no responsibility to experience. Conscience is said to be a sublime oracle independent of education and social influences. All of these views follow naturally from a failure to recognize that all-knowing judgment and belief represent an acquired result of the workings of natural impulses in connection with environment. Upon the ethical side, as has been intimated, the matter at issue concerns the nature of conscience. Conscience has been asserted by orthodox moralists to be unique in origin and subject matter. This same view is embodied by implication in all those popular methods of moral training which attempt to fix rigid authoritative notions of right and wrong by disconnecting moral judgments from the aids and tests which are used in other forms of knowledge. Thus it has been asserted that conscience is an original faculty of illumination, which, if it has not been dimmed by indulgence in sin, shines upon moral truths and objects and reveals them without effort for precisely what they are. Those who hold this view differ enormously amongst themselves as to the nature of the objects of conscience. Some hold them to be general principles, others individual acts, others the order of worth among motives, others the sense of duty in general, and others the unqualified authority of right. Still others carry the implied logic of authority to conclusion and identify knowledge of moral truths with a divine supernatural revelation of a code of commandments. But among these diversities there is agreement about one fundamental. There must be a separate, non-natural faculty of moral knowledge because the things to be known, the matters of right and wrong, good and evil, obligation and responsibility, form a separate domain, separate, that is, from that of ordinary action in its usual human and social significance. The latter activities may be prudential, political, scientific, or economic. But from the standpoint of these theories, they have no moral meaning until they are brought under the purview of this separate, unique department of our nature. It thus turns out that the so-called intuitional theories of moral knowledge concentrate in themselves all the ideas which are subject to criticism in these pages, namely the assertion that morality is distinct in origin, working, and destiny from the natural structure and career of human nature. This fact is the excuse, if excuse be desired, for a seemingly technical excursion that links intellectual activity with the conjoint operation of habit and impulse. End of Part 3, Section 2, The Psychology of Thinking. Read by William Jones. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 3, The Nature of Deliberation. Deliberation as imaginative rehearsal, preference and choice, strife of reason and passion, nature of reason. This LibriVox recording, read by William Jones, is in the public domain. So far, the discussion has ignored the fact that there is an influential school of moralists, best represented in contemporary thought by the utilitarians, which also insists upon the natural, empirical character of moral judgments and beliefs. But unfortunately, this school has followed a false psychology and has tended, by calling out a reaction, actually to strengthen the hands of those who persist in assigning to morals a separate domain of action and in demanding a separate agent of moral knowledge. The essentials of this false psychology consist in two traits. The first that knowledge originates from sensations instead of from habits and impulses, and the second, that judgment about good and evil in action consists in calculation of agreeable and disagreeable consequences, of profit and loss. It is not surprising that this view seems to many to degrade morals as well as to be false to facts. If the logical outcome of an empirical view of moral knowledge is that all morality is concerned with calculating what is expedient, politic, or prudent, measured by consequences in the ways of pleasurable and painful sensations, then, say moralists of the orthodox school, we will have naught to do with such a sordid view. It is a reduction to the absurd of its premises. We will have a separate department for morals and a separate organ of moral knowledge. Our first problem is then to investigate the nature of ordinary judgments upon what it is best or wise to do, or in ordinary language, the nature of deliberation. We begin with a summary assertion that deliberation is a dramatic rehearsal in imagination of various competing possible lines of action. It starts from the blocking of efficient, overt action due to that conflicts of prior habit and newly released impulse to which reference has been made. Then each habit, each impulse involved in the temporary suspense of overt action takes its turn in being tried out. Deliberation is an experiment in finding out what the various lines of possible action really are like. It is an experiment in making various combinations of selected elements of habits and impulses to see what the resultant action would be like if it were entered upon. But the trial is in imagination, not in overt fact. The experiment is carried on by tentative rehearsals in thought, which do not affect physical facts outside the body. Thought runs ahead and foresees outcomes, and thereby avoids having to await the instruction of actual failure and disaster. An act overtly tried out is irrevocable. Its consequences cannot be blotted out. An act tried out in imagination is not final or fatal. It is retrievable. Each conflicting habit and impulse takes its turn in projecting itself upon the screen of imagination. It unrolls a picture of its future history, of the career it would have if it were given head. Although overt exhibition is checked by the pressure of contrary propulsive tendencies, this very inhibition gives habit a chance at manifestation in thought. Deliberation means precisely that activity is disintegrated and that its various elements hold one another up. While none has force enough to become the center of a redirected activity or to dominate a course of action, each has enough power to check others from exercising mastery. Activity does not cease in order to give way to reflection. Activity is turned from execution into intra-organic channels, resulting in dramatic rehearsal. If activity were directly exhibited, it would result in certain experiences and contacts with the environment. It would succeed by making environing objects, things, and persons co-partners in its forward movement, or else it would run against obstacles and be troubled, possibly defeated. These experiences of contact with objects and their qualities give meaning and character to an otherwise fluid, unconscious activity. We find out what seeing means by the objects which are seen. They constitute the significance of visual activity, which would otherwise remain a blank. Pure activity is for consciousness pure emptiness. It acquires a content or filling of means only in static termini, what it comes to rest in, or in the obstacles which check its onward movement and deflect it. As has been remarked, the object is that which objects. There is no difference in this respect between a visible course of conduct and one proposed in deliberation. We have no direct consciousness of what we propose to do. We can judge its nature, assign its meaning, only by following it to the situations whither it leads, noting the objects against which it runs, and seeing how they rebuff, or unexpectedly encourage it. In imagination, as in fact, we know a road only by what we see as we travel on it. Moreover, the objects which prick out the course of proposed act until we see its design also serve to direct eventual overt activity. Every object hit upon as the habit traverses its imaginary path has a direct effect upon existing activities. It reinforces, inhibits, and redirects habits already working, or stirs up others which had not previously actively entered in. In thought as well as in overt action, the objects experienced in following out a course of action attract, repel, satisfy, annoy, promote, and retard. Thus, deliberation proceeds. To say that at last it ceases is to say that choice or decision takes place. Well, what then is choice? Simply hitting in imagination upon an object which furnishes an adequate stimulus to the recovery of overt action. Choice is made as soon as some habit or combination of elements of habits and impulse find a way fully open. Then energy is released, the mind is made up, composed, and unified. As long as deliberation pictures shoals or rocks, or troublesome gales as marking the route of a contemplated voyage, deliberation goes on. But when the first various factors in action fit harmoniously together, when imagination finds no annoying hindrance, when there is a picture of open seas, filled sails, and favoring winds, the voyage is definitely entered upon. This decisive direction of action constitutes choice. It is a great error to suppose that we have no preferences until there is a choice. We are always biased beings, tending in one direction rather than another. The occasion of deliberation is an excess of preferences, not natural apathy or an absence of likings. We want things that are incompatible with one another. Therefore, we have to make a choice of what we really want or of the course of action, that is, which most fully releases activities. Choice is not the emergence of preference out of indifference. It is the emergence of a unified preference out of competing preferences. Biases that had held one another in check now, temporarily at least, reinforce one another and constitute a unified attitude. The moment arrives when imagination pictures an objective consequence of action, which supplies an adequate stimulus and releases definitive action. All deliberation is a search for a way to act, not for a final terminus. Its office is to facilitate stimulation. Hence, there is a reasonable and unreasonable choice. The object thought of may simply stimulate some impulse or habit to a pitch of intensity where it is temporarily irresistible. It then overrides all competitors and secures for itself the sole right-of-way. The object looms large in imagination. It swells to fill the field. It allows no room for alternatives. It absorbs us, enraptures us, carries us away, sweeps us off our feet by its own attractive force. Then choice is arbitrary and unreasonable. But the object thought of may be one which stimulates by unifying and harmonizing different competing tendencies. It may release an activity in which all are fulfilled, not indeed in their original form, but in a sublimated fashion, that is, in a way which modifies the original direction of each by reducing it to a component along with others in an action of transformed quality. Nothing is more extraordinary than the delicacy, promptness, and ingenuity with which deliberation is capable of making eliminations and recombinations in projecting the course of a possible activity. To every shade of imagined circumstance there is a vibrating response, and to every complex situation a sensitiveness as to its integrity, a feeling of whether it does justice to all facts or overrides some to the advantage of others. Decision is reasonable when deliberation is so conducted. There may be error in the result, but it comes from lack of data, not from ineptitude in handling them. These facts give us the key to the old controversy as to the respective places of desire and reason in conduct. It is notorious that some moralists have deplored the influence of desire. They have found the heart of strife between good and evil in the conflict of desire with reason, in which the former has force on its side and the latter authority. But reasonableness is in fact a quality of an effective relationship among desires rather than a thing opposed to desire. It signifies the order, perspective, and proportion which is achieved during deliberation out of a diversity of earlier incompatible preferences. Choice is reasonable when it induces us to act reasonably, that is, with regard to the claims of each of the competing habits and impulses. This implies, of course, the presence of a comprehensive object, one which coordinates, organizes, and functions each factor of the situation which give rise to conflict, suspense, and deliberation. This is true when some bad impulses and habits enter in as when approved ones require unification. We have already seen the effects of choking them off, of efforts at direct suppression. Bad habits can be subdued only by being utilized as elements in a new, more generous and comprehensive scheme of action, and good ones be preserved from rot only by similar use. The nature of the strife of reason and passion is well stated by William James. The cue of passion, he says in effect, is to keep imagination dwelling upon those objects which are congenial to it, which feed it, and which by feeding it intensify its force until it crowds out all thought of other objects. An impulse or habit which is strongly emotional magnifies all objects that are congruous with it, and smothers those which are opposed whenever they present themselves. A passionate activity learns to work itself up artificially, as Oliver Cromwell indulged in fits of anger when he wanted to do things that his conscience would not justify. A presentiment is felt that if the thought of contrary objects is allowed to get a lodgment in imagination, These objects will work and work to chill and freeze out the ardent passion of the moment. The conclusion is not that the emotional, passionate phase of action can be or should be eliminated in behalf of a bloodless reason. More passions, not fewer, is the answer. To check the influence of hate, there must be sympathy, while to rationalize sympathy, there are needed emotions of curiosity, caution, and respect for the freedom of others. Dispositions which evoke objects which balance those called up by sympathy and prevent its degeneration into maudlin sentiment and meddling interference. Rationality, once more, is not a force to evoke against impulse and habit. It is the attainment of a working harmony among diverse desires. Reason, as a noun, signifies the happy cooperation of a multitude of dispositions, such as sympathy, curiosity, exploration, experimentation, frankness, and pursuit to follow things through, circumspection, to look about at the context, etc., etc. The elaborate systems of science are born not of reason, but of impulses, at first slight and flickering. Impulses to handle, move about, to hunt, to uncover, to mix things separated and divide things combined, to talk and to listen. Method is their effectual organization into continuous dispositions of inquiry, development, and testing. It occurs after these acts and because of their consequences. Reason, the rational attitude, is the resulting disposition, not a ready-made antecedent which can be invoked at will and set into movement. The man who would intelligently cultivate intelligence will widen, not narrow, his life of strong impulses, while aiming at their happy coincidence in cooperation. The clue of impulse is, as we say, to start something. It is in a hurry. It rushes us off our feet. It leaves no time for examination, memory, and foresight. But the clue of reason is, as the phrase goes, to stop and think. Force, however, is required to stop the ongoing of a habit or impulse. This is supplied by another habit. The resulting period of delay, of suspended and postponed overt action, is the period in which activities that are refused direct outlet project imaginative counterparts. It signifies, in technical phrase, the mediation of impulse. For an isolated impulse is immediate, narrowing the world down to the directly present. Variety of competing tendencies enlarges the world. It brings a diversity of considerations before the mind, and enables action to take place finally in view of an object which is generously conceived and delicately refined and composed by a long process of selections and combinations. In popular phrase, to be deliberate is to be slow, unhurried. It takes time to put objects in order. There are, however, vices of reflection as well as of impulse. We may not look far enough ahead because we are hurried into action by stress of impulse. But we may also become over-interested in the delights of reflection. We become afraid of assuming the responsibilities of decisive choice and action, and in general be sicklied over by a pale cast of thought. We may become so curious about remote and abstract matters that we give only a begrudged, impatient attention to the things right about us. We may fancy we are glorifying the love of truth for its own sake when we are only indulging a pet occupation and slighting demands of the immediate situation. Men who devote themselves to thinking are likely to be unusually unthinking in some respects as for example in immediate personal relationships. A man to whom exact scholarship is an absorbing pursuit may be more than ordinarily vague in ordinary matters. Humility and impartiality may be shown in a specialized field, and pettiness and arrogance in dealing with other persons. Reason is not an antecedent force which serves as a panacea. It is a laborious achievement of habit needing to be continually worked over. A balanced arrangement of propulsive activities manifested in deliberation, namely reason, depends upon a sensitive and proportionate emotional sensitiveness. Only a one-sided, over-specialized emotion leads to thinking of it as separate from emotion. The traditional association of justice and reason has good psychology back of it. Both imply a balanced distribution of thought and energy. Deliberation is irrational in the degree in which an end is so fixed, a passion or interest so absorbing, that the foresight of consequences is warped to include only what furthers execution of its predetermined bias. Deliberation is rational in the degree in which forethought flexibly remakes old aims and habits, institutes perception, and love of new ends and acts. End of Part 3, Section 3, The Nature of Deliberation. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 4, Deliberation and Calculation. Dealing with error in utilitarian theory, place of the pleasant, hedonistic calculus, deliberation and prediction. This LibriVox recording, read by William Jones, is in the public domain. We now return to a consideration of the utilitarian theory, according to which deliberation consists in calculation of the courses of action on the basis of the profit and loss to which they lead. The contrast of this notion with facts is obvious. The office of deliberation is not to supply an inducement to act by figuring out where the most advantage is to be procured. It is to resolve entanglements in existing activity, restore continuity, recover harmony, utilize loose impulse, and redirect habit. To this end, observation of present conditions and recollection of previous situations are devoted. Deliberation has its beginning in troubled activity, and its conclusion in choice of a course of action which straightens it out. It no more resembles the casting up of accounts of profit and loss and pleasures and pains than an actor engaged in drama resembles a clerk recording debit and credit items in his ledger. The primary fact is that man is a being who responds in action to the stimuli of the environment. This fact is complicated in deliberation, but it certainly is not abolished. We continue to react to an object presented in imagination as we react to objects presented in observation. The baby does not move to the mother's breast because of calculation of the advantages of warmth and food over against the pains of effort. Nor does the miser seek gold, nor the architect strive to make plans, nor the physician to heal, because of reckonings of comparative advantage and disadvantage. Habit or occupation furnishes the necessity of forward action in one case as instinct does in the other. We do not act from reasoning, but reasoning puts before us objects which are not directly or sensibly present, so that we may then react directly to these objects with aversion, attraction, indifference, or attachment, precisely as we would to the same objects if they were physically present. In the end, it results in a case of direct stimulus and response. In one case, the stimulus is presented at once through sense. In the other case, it is indirectly reached through memory and constructive imagination. But the matter of directness and indirectness concerns the way stimulus is reached, not the way in which it operates. Joy and suffering, pain and pleasure, the agreeable and disagreeable, play their considerable role in deliberation. Not, however, by way of a calculated estimate of future delights and miseries, but by way of experiencing present ones. The reaction of joy and sorrow, elation and depression, is as natural a response to objects presented in imagination as to those presented in sense. Complacency and annoyance follow hard at the heels of any object presented in image as they do upon its sensuous experience. Some objects, when thought of, are congruent to our existing state of activity. They fit in, they are welcome. They agree or are agreeable not as a matter of calculation, but as a matter of experienced fact. Other objects rasp. They cut across activity. They are tiresome, hateful, unwelcome. They disagree with the existing trend of activity. That is, they are disagreeable, and in no other way than as a bore who prolongs his visit, a dun we can't pay, or a pestiferous mosquito who goes on buzzing. We do not think of future losses and expansions. We think, through imagination, of objects into which in the future some course of action will run, and we are now delighted or depressed, pleased or pained at what is presented. This running commentary of likes and dislikes, attractions and disdains, joys and sorrows, reveals to any man who is intelligent enough to note them and to study their occasions his own character. It instructs him as to the composition and direction of the activities that make him what he is. To know what jars an activity and what agrees with it is to know something important about that activity and about ourselves. Someone may ask what practical difference it makes whether we are influenced by calculation of future joys and annoyances or by experience of present ones. To such a question one can hardly reply except in the words, all the difference in the world. In the first place, no difference can be more important than that which concerns the nature of the subject matter of deliberation. The calculative theory would have it that this subject matter is future feelings and sensations, and that actions and thought are external means to get and avoid these sensations. If such a theory has any practical influence, it is to advise a person to concentrate upon his own most subjective and private feelings. It gives him no choice except between a sickly introspection and an intricate calculus of remote, inaccessible, and indeterminate results. In fact, deliberation, as a tentative trying out of various courses of action, is outlooking. It flies toward and settles upon objective situations, not upon feelings. No doubt, we sometimes fall to deliberating upon the effect of an action upon our future feelings, thinking of a situation mainly with reference to the comforts and discomforts it will excite in us. But these moments are precisely our sentimental moments of self-pity or self-glorification. They conduce to morbidity, sophistication, and isolation from others, while facing our acts in terms of their objective consequences leads to enlightenment and to consideration of others. The first objection, therefore, to deliberation as a calculation of future feelings is that if it is consistently adhered to, it makes an abnormal case the standard one. If, however, an objective estimate is attempted, thought gets speedily lost in a task impossible of achievement. Future pleasures and pains are influenced by two factors which are independent of present choice and effort. They depend on our own state at some future moment and upon the surrounding circumstances of that moment. Both of these are variables which change independently of present resolve and action. They are much more important determinants of future sensations than is anything which can now be calculated. Things sweet in anticipation are bitter in actual taste, and things we now turn from in aversion are welcome at another moment in our career. Independently of deep changes in character, such as from mercifulness to callousness, from fretfulness to cheerfulness, there are unavoidable changes in the waxing and waning of activity. A child pictures a future of unlimited toys and unrestricted sweetmeats. An adult pictures an object as giving pleasure while he is empty, while the thing arrives in a moment of repletion. A sympathetic person reckons, upon the utilitarian basis, the pains of others as a debit item in his calculations. But why not harden himself so that others' sufferings won't count? Why not foster an arrogant cruelty so that the suffering of others, which will follow from one's own action, will fall on the credit side of the reckoning, be pleasurable, all to the good? Future pleasures and pains, even of one's own, are among the things most elusive of calculation. Of all things, they lend themselves least readily to anything approaching a mathematical calculus. And the further into the future we extend our view, and the more the pleasures of others enter into the account, the more hopeless does the problem of estimating future consequences become. All of the elements become more and more indeterminate. Even if one could form a fairly accurate picture of the things that give pleasure to most people at the present moment, an exceedingly difficult task, he cannot foresee the detailed circumstances which will give a decisive turn to enjoyment at future times and remote places. Do pleasures due to defective education or unrefined disposition, to say nothing of the pleasures of sensuality and brutality, rank the same as those of cultivated persons having acute social sensitiveness? The only reason the impossibility of the hedonistic calculus is not self-evident is that theorists, in considering it, unconsciously substitute for calculation of future pleasures an appreciation of present ones, a present realization in imagination of future objective situations. For, in truth, a man's judgment of future joys and sorrows is but a projection of what now satisfies and annoys him. A man of considerate disposition now feels hurt at the thought of an act bringing harm to others, and so he is on the lookout for consequences of that sort, ranking them as of high importance. He may even be so abnormally sensitive to such consequences that he is held back from needed vigorous action. He fears to do the things which are for the real welfare of others because he shrinks from the thought of the pain to be inflicted upon them by needed measures. A man of an executive type, engrossed in carrying through a scheme, will react in present emotion to everything concerned with its external success. The pain its execution brings to others will not occur to him, or if it does, his mind will easily glide over it. This sort of consequence will seem to him of slight importance in comparison with the commercial or political changes which bulk in his plan. What a man foresees and fails to foresee, what he appraises highly and at a low rate, what he deems important and trivial, what he dwells upon and what he slurs over, what he easily recalls and what he naturally forgets, all of these things depend upon his character. His estimate of future consequences of the agreeable and annoying is consequently of much greater value as an index of what he now is than as a prediction of future results. One has only to read between the lines to see the enormous difference that marks off modern utilitarianism from Epicureanism, in spite of similarities in professed psychologies. Epicureanism is too worldly wise to indulge in attempts to base present action upon precarious estimates of future and universal pleasures and pains. On the contrary, it says, let the future go, for life is uncertain. Who knows when it will end, or what fortune the morrow will bring? Foster then with jealous care every gift of pleasure now allotted to you. Dwell upon it with lingering love. Prolong it as best you may. Utilitarianism, on the contrary, was a part of a philanthropic and reform movement of the 19th century. Its recommendation of an elaborate and impossible calculus was in reality part of a movement to develop a type of character which should have a wide social outlook, sympathy with the experiences of all sentient creatures, and one zealous about the social effects of all proposed acts, especially those of collective legislation and administration. It was concerned not with extracting the honey of the passing moment, but with breeding improved bees and constructing hives. After all, the object of foresight of consequences is not to predict the future. It is to ascertain the meaning of present activities and to secure, so far as possible, a present activity with a unified meaning. We are not the creators of heaven and earth. We have no responsibility for their operations, save as their motions are altered by our movements. Our concern is with the significance of that slight fraction of total activity which starts from ourselves. The best laid plans of men as well of mice gang agley, and for the same reason, inability to dominate the future. The power of man and mouse is infinitely constricted in comparison with the power of events. Men always build better or worse than they know, for their acts are taken up into the broad sweep of events. Hence the problem of deliberation is not to calculate future happenings, but to appraise the present proposed actions. We judge present desires and habits by their tendency to produce certain consequences. It is our business to watch the course of our action so as to see what is the significance, the import of our habits and dispositions. The future outcome is not certain, but neither is it certain what the present fire will do in the future. It may be unexpectedly fed or extinguished, but its tendency is a knowable matter, what it will do under certain circumstances. And so we know what is the tendency of malice, charity, conceit, and patience. We know, by observing their consequences, by recollecting what we have observed, by using that recollection in constructive, imaginative forecasts of the future, by using the thought of future consequence to tell the quality of the act now proposed. Deliberation is not calculation of indeterminate future results. The present, not the future, is ours. No shrewdness, no store of information will make it ours. But by constant watchfulness concerning the tendency of acts, by noting disparities between former judgments and actual outcomes, and tracing that part of the disparity that was due to deficiency and excess in disposition, we come to know the meaning of present acts and to guide them in the light of that meaning. The moral is to develop conscientiousness, ability to judge the significance of what we are doing and use that judgment in directing what we do, not by means of direct cultivation of something called conscience or reason, or a faculty of moral knowledge, but by fostering those impulses and habits which experience has shown to make us sensitive, generous, imaginative, and impartial in perceiving the tendency of our inchoate, dawning activities. Every attempt to forecast the future is subject, in the end, to the auditing of present concrete impulse and habit. Therefore, the important thing is the fostering of those habits and impulses which lead to a broad, just, sympathetic survey of situations. The occasion of deliberation, that is, of the attempt to find a stimulus to complete overt action in thought of some future object, is confusion and uncertainty in present activities. A similar division in activities and need of a like deliberative activity, for the sake of recovery of unity, is sure to occur, to reoccur again and again, no matter how wise the decision. Even the most comprehensive deliberation leading to the most momentous choice only fixes a disposition which has to be continuously applied in new and unforeseen conditions and readapted by future deliberations. Always our old habits and dispositions carry us into new fields. We have to be always learning and relearning the meaning of our active tendencies. Does not this reduce moral life to the futile toil of a Sisyphus who is forever rolling a stone uphill, only to have it roll back so he has to repeat his old task? Yes, judged from progress made in a control of conditions which shall stay put and which excludes the necessity of future deliberations and reconsiderations. No, because continual search and experimentation to discover the meaning of changing activity keeps activity alive, growing in significance. The future situation involved in deliberation is of necessity marked by contingency. What it will be, in fact, remains dependent upon conditions that escape our foresight and power of regulation. But foresight, which draws liberally upon the lessons of past experience, reveals the tendency, the meaning of present action. And once more, it is this present meaning, rather than the future outcome, which counts. Imaginative forethought of the probable consequences of a proposed act keeps that act from sinking below consciousness into routine habit or whimsical brutality. It preserves the meaning of that act alive and keeps it growing in depth and refinement of meaning. There is no limit to the amount of meaning which reflective and meditative habit is capable of importing into even simple acts. Just as the most splendid successes of the skillful executive who manipulates events may be accompanied by an incredibly meager and superficial consciousness. End of Part 3, Section 4, Deliberation and Calculation. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 5, The Uniqueness of Good. concerning fallacy of a single good, applied to utilitarianism, profit and personality, means and ends. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. The reason for dividing conduct into two distinct regions, one of expediency and the other of morality, disappears when the psychology that identifies ordinary deliberation with calculation is disposed of. There is seen to be but one issue involved in all reflection upon conduct: the rectifying of present troubles and the harmonization of present incompatibilities by projecting a course of action which gathers into itself the meaning of them all. The recognition of the true psychology also reveals to us the nature of good or satisfaction. Good consists in the meaning that is experienced to belong to an activity when conflict and entanglement of various incompatible impulses and habits terminate in a unified, orderly release of action. This human good, being a fulfillment of conditioned upon thought, differs from the pleasures which an animal nature, of course we also remain animals so far as we do not think, hits upon accidentally. Moreover, there is a genuine difference between a false good, a spurious satisfaction, and a true good, and there is an empirical test for discovering the difference. The unification which ends thought in act may be only a superficial compromise, not a real decision, but a postponement of the issue. Many of our so-called decisions are of this nature. Or it may present, as we have seen, a victory of a temporarily intense impulse over its rivals, a unity by oppression and suppression, not by coordination. These seeming unifications, which are not unifications of fact, are revealed by the event and by subsequent occurrences. It is one of the penalties of evil choice, perhaps the chief penalty, that the wrongdoer becomes more and more incapable of detecting these objective revelations of himself. In quality, the good is never twice alike. It never copies itself. It is new every morning, fresh every evening. It is unique in its every presentation, for it marks the resolution of a distinctive complication of competing habits and impulses which can never repeat itself. Only with a habit rigid to the point of immobility could exactly the same good recur twice. And with such rigid routines, the same good does not after all recur, for it does not even occur. There is no consciousness at all, either of good or bad. Rigid habits sink below the level of any meaning at all. And since we live in a moving world, they plunge us finally against conditions to which they are not adapted, and so terminate in disaster. To utilitarianism, with all its defects, belongs the distinction of enforcing, in an unforgettable way, the fact that moral good, like every good, consists in a satisfaction of the forces of human nature, in welfare, in happiness. To Bentham remains, in spite of all crudities and eccentricities, the imperishable renown of forcing home to the popular consciousness that conscience, intelligence applied to in moral matters, is too often not intelligence, but is veiled caprice, dogmatic ipse dixitism, and vested class interest. It is truly conscience only as it contributes to relief of misery and promotion of happiness. An examination of utilitarianism brings out, however, the catastrophe involved in thinking of the good, to which intelligence is pertinent, as consisting in future pleasures and pains, and moral reflection as their algebraic calculus. It emphasizes the contrast between such conceptions of good and of intelligence and the facts of human nature, according to which good, happiness, is found in the present meaning of activity, depending upon the proportion, order, and freedom introduced into it by thought as it discovers objects which release and unify otherwise contending elements. An adequate discussion of why utilitarianism, with its just insight into the central place of good and its ardent devotion to rendering morals more intelligent and more equitably human, took its one-sided course and thereby provoked an intensified reaction to the transcendental and dogmatic morals, would take us far afield into social conditions and the antecedent history of thought. We can deal with only one factor, the domination of intellectual interest by economic considerations. The Industrial Revolution was bound in any case to give a new direction to thought. It enforced liberation from otherworldly concerns by fixing attention upon the possibility of the betterment of this world through control and utilization of natural forces. It opened up marvelous possibilities in industry and commerce, and new social conditions conducive to invention, ingenuity, enterprise, constructive energy, and an impersonal habit of mind dealing with mechanisms rather than appearances. But new movements do not start in a new and clear field. The context of old institutions and corresponding habits of thought persisted. The new movement was perverted in theory because prior established conditions deflected it in practice. Thus the new industrialism was largely the old feudalism, living in a bank instead of a castle, and brandishing the check of credit instead of the sword. An old theological doctrine of total depravity was continued and carried over in the idea of an inherent laziness of human nature which rendered it averse to useful work unless bribed by expectations of pleasure or driven by fears of pains. This being the incentive to action, it followed that the office of reason is only to enlighten the search for good or gain by instituting a more exact calculus of profit and loss. Happiness was thus identified with a maximum net gain of pleasures on the basis of analogy with business conducted for pecuniary profit and directed by means of a science of accounting dealing with quantities of receipts and expenses expressed in definite monetary units. Footnote 6. I owe the suggestion of this mode of interpreting the hedonistic calculus of utilitarianism to Dr. Wesley Mitchell. See his articles in Journal of Political Economy, Volume 18. Compare also his article in Political Science Quarterly, Volume 33. End footnote. For business was conducted as a matter of fact with primary reference to procuring gain and averting loss. Gain and loss were reckoned in terms of units of money, assumed to be fixed and equal, exactly comparable whether loss or gain occurred, while business foresight reduced future prospects to definitely measured forms, to dollars and cents. A dollar is a dollar, past, present, or future, and every business transaction, every expenditure and consumption of time, energy, and goods is in theory capable of exact statement in terms of dollars. Generalize this point of view into the notion that gain is the object of all action, that gain takes the form of pleasure, that there are definite commensurable units of pleasure which are exactly offset by units of pain, loss, and the working psychology of the Benthamite school is at hand. Now, admitting that the device of money accounting makes possible more exact estimates of the consequences of many acts than is otherwise possible, and that accordingly the use of money and accounting may work a triumph for the application of intelligence in daily affairs. Yet there exists a difference in kind between business calculation of profit and loss and deliberation upon what purposes to form. Some of these differences are inherent and insuperable. Others of them are due to the nature of present business conducted for pecuniary profit, and would disappear if business were conducted primarily for service of needs. But it is important to see how, in the latter case, the assimilation of business accounting and normal deliberation would occur. For it would not consist in making deliberation identical with calculation of loss and gain. It would proceed in the opposite direction. It would make accounting and auditing a subordinate factor in discovering the meaning of present activity. Calculation would be a means of stating future results more exactly and objectively, and thus of making action more humane. Its function would be that of statistics in all social science. But first, as to the inherent difference between deliberation regarding business profit and loss and deliberation about ordinary conduct. The distinction between wide and narrow use of reason has already been noted. The latter holds a fixed end in view and deliberates only upon means of reaching it. The former regards the end in view in deliberation as tentative and permits, nay, encourages, the coming into view of consequences which will transform it and create a new purpose and plan. Now, business calculation is obviously of the kind where the end is taken for granted and does not enter into deliberation. It resembles the case in which a man has already made his final decision, say to take a walk, and deliberates only upon what walk to take. His end in view already exists. It is not questioned. The question is as to comparative advantages of this tramp or that. Deliberation is not free, but occurs within the limits of a decision reached by some prior deliberation, or else fixed by unthinking routine. Suppose, however, that a man's question is not which path to walk upon, whether to walk or to stay with a friend whom continued confinement has rendered peevish and uninteresting as a companion. The utilitarian theory demands that in the latter case the two alternatives will be of the same kind, alike in quality, that their only difference be a quantitative one of plus or minus in pleasure. This assumption that all desires and dispositions, all habits and impulses, are the same in quality is equivalent to the assertion that no real significant conflict among them is possible, and hence there is no need of discovering an object and an activity which will bring them into unity. It asserts by implication that there is no genuine doubt or suspense as to the meaning of any impulse or habit. Their meaning is ready-made, fixed. Pleasure. The only problem or doubt is as to the amount of pleasure or pain that is involved. This assumption does violence to fact. The poignancy of situations that evoke reflection lies in the fact that we really do not know the meaning of the tendencies that are pressing for action. We have to search, to experiment. Deliberation is a work of discovery. Conflict is acute. One impulse carries us one way into one situation, and another impulse takes us another way to a radically different objective result. Deliberation is not an attempt to do away with this opposition of quality by reducing it to one of amount, It is an attempt to uncover the conflict in its full scope and bearing. What we want to find out is what difference each impulse and habit imports, to reveal qualitative incompatibilities by detecting the different courses to which they commit us, the different dispositions they form and foster, the different situations into which they plunge us. In short, the thing actually at stake in any serious deliberation is not a difference of quantity, but what kind of person one is to become, what sort of self is in the making, and what kind of a world is making. This is plain enough in those crucial decisions where the course of life is thrown into widely different channels, where the pattern of life is rendered different and diversely dyed according as this alternative or that is chosen. Deliberation as to whether to be a merchant or a school teacher, a physician or a politician is not a choice of quantities. It is just what it appears to be, a choice of careers which are incompatible with one another, within each of which definitive inclusions and rejections are involved. With the difference in career belongs a difference in the constitution of the self, of habits of thought and feeling, as well as of outward action. With it comes profound differences in all future objective relationships. Our minor decisions differ in acuteness and range, but not in principle. Our world does not so obviously hang upon any one of them, but put together they make the world what it is in meaning for each one of us. Crucial decisions can hardly be more than a disclosure of the cumulative force of trivial choices. A radical distinction thus exists between deliberation, where the only question is whether to invest money in this bond or that stock, and deliberation, where the primary decision is as to the kind of activity which is to be engaged in. Definite quantitative calculation is possible in the former case because a decision as to kind or direction of action does not have to be made. It has been decided already, whether by persistence of habit or prior deliberation, that the man is to be an investor. The significant thing in decisions proper, the course of action, the kind of a self simply doesn't enter in. It isn't a question. To reduce all cases of judgment of action to the simplified and comparatively unimportant case of calculation of quantities is to miss the whole point of deliberation. Footnote 7. So far as I am aware, Dr. H.W. Stewart was the first to point out this difference between economic and moral valuations in his essay in Studies in Logical Theory. End of footnote. It is another way of saying the same thing to note that business calculations about pecuniary gain never concern direct use in experience. They are, as such, not deliberations about good or satisfaction at all. The man who decides to put business activity before all other claims whatsoever, before that of family or country, or art or science, does make a choice about satisfaction or good, but he makes it as a man, not as a businessman. On the other hand, what is to be done with business profit when it accrues, except to invest in similar undertakings, does not enter at all into strictly business deliberation. Its use, in which alone good or satisfaction is found, is left indeterminate and contingent upon further deliberation, or else is left a matter of routine habit. We do not eat money, or wear it, or marry it, or listen for musical strains to issue from it. If by any chance a man prefers a less amount of money to a greater amount, it is not for economic reasons. Pecuniary profit in itself in other words, is always strictly instrumental, and it is of the nature of this instrument to be effective in proportion to size. In choosing with respect to it, we are not making a significant choice, a choice of ends. We have already seen, however, there is something abnormal and in the strict sense impossible in mere means. In, that is, instruments totally dissevered from ends. We may view economic activity in abstraction, but it does not exist by itself. Business takes for granted non-business uses to which its results are to be put. The stimuli for economic activity, in the sense in which business means activity subject to monetary reckoning, are found in non-pecuniary, non-economic activities. Taken by itself, then, economic action throws no light upon the nature of satisfaction and the relation of intelligence to it, because the whole question of satisfaction is either taken for granted or else is ignored by it. Only when money making is itself taken as a good does it exhibit anything pertinent to the question. And when it is so taken, then the question is not one of future gain, but of present activity and its meaning. Business then becomes an activity carried on for its own sake. It is then a career, a continuous occupation in which are developed daring, adventure, power, rivalry, overcoming of competitors, conspicuous achievement which attracts admiration, play of imagination, technical knowledge, skill in foresight and making combinations, and management of men and goods, and so on. In this case, it exemplifies what has been said about good or happiness as incorporating in itself, at present, the foreseen future consequences that result from intelligent action. The problem concerns the quality of such good. In short, the attempt to assimilate other activities to the model of economic activity, defined as a calculated pursuit of gain, reverses the state of the facts. The economic man, defined as a creature devoted to an enlightened or calculating pursuit of gain, is morally objectionable because the conception of such a being empirically falsifies empirical facts. Love of pecuniary gain is an undoubted and powerful fact, but it and its importance are affairs of social, not of psychological nature. It is not a primary fact which can be used to account for other phenomena. It depends upon other impulses and habits. It expresses and organizes the use to which they are put. It cannot be used to define the nature of desire, effort, and satisfaction because it embodies a socially selected type of desire and satisfaction. It affords, like steeplechasing or collecting postage stamps, seeking political office, astronomical observation of the heavens, a special case of desire, effort, and happiness. And like them, it is subject to examination, criticism, and valuation in the light of the place it occupies in the system of developing activities. The reason that it is so easy, and for specific purposes, so useful to select economic activities and subject them to separate scientific treatment is because the men who engage in it are men who are also more than businessmen, whose usual habits may be more or less safely guessed at. As human beings, they have desires and occupations which are affected by social custom, expectation, and admiration. The uses to which gains will be put, that is, the current scheme of activities into which they enter as factors, are passed over only because they are so inevitably present. Support of family, of church, philanthropic benefactions, political influence, automobiling, command of luxuries, freedom of movement, respect for others are, in general terms, some of the obvious activities into which economic activity fits. This context of activities enters into the real makeup and meaning of economic activity. Calculated pursuit of gain is in fact never what it is made out to be when economic action is separated from the rest of life. For, in fact, it is what it is because of a complex social environment involving scientific, legal, political, and domestic conditions. A certain tragic fate seems to attend all intellectual movements. That of utilitarianism is suggested in the not infrequent criticism that it exaggerated the role of rational thought in human conduct, and that it assumed that everybody is moved by conscious considerations, and that all that is really necessary is to make the process of consideration sufficiently enlightened. Then it is objected that a better psychology reveals that men are not moved by thought, but rather by instinct and habit. Thus, a partially sound criticism is employed to conceal the one factor in utilitarianism from which we ought to learn something. It is used to foster an obscurantist doctrine of trusting to impulse, instinct, or intuition. Neither the utilitarians nor anyone else can exaggerate the proper office of reflection, of intelligence, in conduct. The mistake lay not here, but in false conception of what constitutes reflection and deliberation. The truth that men are not moved by consideration of self-interest, that men are not good judges of where the interests lie, and are not moved to act by these judgments, cannot properly be converted into the belief that consideration of consequences is a negligible factor in conduct. So far as it is negligible in fact, it evinces the rudimentary character of civilization. We may indeed safely start from the assumption that impulse and habit, not thought, are the primary determinants of conduct. But the conclusion to be drawn from these facts is that the need is therefore the greater for cultivation of thought. The error of utilitarianism is not at this point. It is found in its wrong conception of what thought, deliberation, is and does. End of Part 3, Section 5, Deliberation and Calculation. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 6, The Nature of Aims. Addressing a theory of final ends, aims as directive means, ends as justifying means, meaning well as an aim, wishes, and aims. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by William Jones. Our problem now concerns the nature of ends, that is, ends in view or aims. The essential elements in the problem have already been stated. It has been pointed out that the ends or objectives of conduct are those foreseen consequences which influence present deliberation and which finally bring it to rest by furnishing an adequate stimulus to overt action. Consequently, ends arise and function within action. They are not, as current theories too often imply, things lying beyond activity at which the latter is directed. They are not, strictly speaking, ends or termini of action at all. They are terminals of deliberation, and so turning points in activity. Many opposed moral theories agree, however, in placing ends beyond action, although they differ in their notions of what the ends are. The utilitarian sets up pleasure as such an outside and beyond, as something necessary to induce action and in which it terminates. Many harsh critics of utilitarianism have, however, agreed that there is some end in which action terminates, a final goal. They have denied that pleasure is such an outside aim and put perfection or self-realization in its place. The entire popular notion of ideals is infected with this conception of some fixed end beyond activity at which we should aim. According to this view, ends in themselves come before aims. We have a moral aim only as our purpose coincides with some end in itself. We ought to aim at the latter, whether we actually do or not. When men believed that fixed ends existed for all normal changes in nature, the conception of similar ends for men was but a special case of a general belief. If the changes in a tree from acorn to full-grown oak were regulated by an end, which was somehow imminent or potential in all the less perfect forms, and if change was simply the effort to realize a perfect or complete form, then the acceptance of a like view for human conduct was consonant with the rest of what passed for science. Such a view, consistent and systematic, was foisted by Aristotle upon Western culture and endured for 2,000 years. When the notion was expelled from natural science by the intellectual revolution of the 17th century, logically it should also have disappeared from the theory of human action. But man is not logical, and his intellectual history is a record of mental reserves and compromises. He hangs on to what he can in his old beliefs, even when he is compelled to surrender their logical basis. So the doctrine of fixed ends in themselves, at which human acts are or should be directed, and by which they are regulated, if they are regulated at all, persisted in morals and was made the cornerstone of orthodox moral theory. The immediate effect was to dislocate moral from natural science, to divide man's world as it never had been divided in prior culture. One point of view, one method and spirit animated inquiry into natural occurrences. A radically opposite set of ideas prevailed about men's affairs. Completion of the scientific change begun in the 17th century thus depends upon a revision of the current notion of ends of action as fixed limits and conclusions. In fact, ends are ends in view, or aims. They arise out of natural effects or consequences which in the beginning are hit upon or stumbled upon so far as any purpose is concerned. Men like some of the consequences and dislike others. Henceforth, or till attraction and repulsion alter, attaining or averting similar consequences are aims or ends. These consequences constitute the meaning and value of an activity as it comes under deliberation. Meantime, of course, imagination is busy. Old consequences are enhanced, recombined, and modified in imagination. Invention operates. Actual consequences, that is, effects which have happened in the past, become possible future consequences of acts still to be performed. This operation of imaginative thought complicates the relation of ends to activity, but it does not alter the substantial fact: ends are foreseen consequences which arise in the course of activity and which are employed to give activity added meaning and to direct its further course. They are in no sense ends of action. In being ends of deliberation, they are redirecting pivots in action. Men shoot and throw. At first this is done as an instinctive or natural reaction to some situation. The result, when it is observed, gives a new meaning to the activity. Henceforth, men in throwing and shooting think of it in terms of its outcome. They act intelligently or have an end. Liking the activity in its acquired meaning, they not only take aim when they throw instead of throwing at random, but they find or make targets at which to aim. This is the origin and nature of goals of action. They are ways of defining and deepening the meaning of activity. Having an end or aim is thus a characteristic of present activity. It is the means by which an activity becomes adapted when otherwise it would be blind and disorderly, or by which it gets meaning when otherwise it would be mechanical. In a strict sense, an end in view is a means in present action. Present action is not a means to a remote end. Men do not shoot because targets exist, but they set up targets in order that throwing and shooting may be more effective and significant. A mariner does not sail toward the stars, but by noting the stars, he is aided in conducting his present activity of sailing. A port or harbor is his objective, but only in the sense of reaching it, not of taking possession of it. The harbor stands in his thought as a significant point at which his activity will need redirection. Activity will not cease when the port is attained, but merely the present direction of activity. The port is as truly the beginning of another mode of activity as it is the termination of the present one. The only reason we ignore this fact is because it is empirically taken for granted. We know without thinking that our ends are perforce beginnings. But theories of ends and ideals have converted a theoretical ignoring, which is equivalent to practical acknowledgement, into an intellectual denial, and have thereby confused and perverted the nature of ends. Even the most important among all the consequences of an act is not necessarily its aim. Results which are objectively most important may not even be thought of at all. Ordinarily, a man does not think in connection with exercise of his profession that it will sustain him and his family in existence. The end thought of is uniquely important, but it is indispensable to state the respect in which it is important. It gives the decisive clue to the act to be performed under the existing circumstances. It is that particular foreseen object that will stimulate the act which relieves existing troubles and straightens out existing entanglements. In a temporary annoyance, even if only that caused by the singing of a mosquito, the thought of that which gives relief may engross the mind in spite of consequences much more important, objectively speaking. Moralists have deplored such facts as evidence of levity. But the remedy, if a remedy be needed, is not found in insisting upon the importance of ends in general. It is found in a change of the dispositions which make things either immediately troublesome or tolerable or agreeable. When ends are regarded as literally ends to action rather than as directive stimuli to present choice, they are frozen and isolated. It makes no difference whether the end is a natural good, like health, or a moral good, like honesty. Set up as complete and exclusive, as demanding and justifying action as a means to itself, it leads to narrowness. In extreme cases, fanaticism, inconsiderateness, arrogance, and hypocrisy. Joshua's reputed success in getting the sun to stand still to serve his desire is recognized to have involved a miracle. But moral theorists constantly assume that the continuous course of events can be arrested at the point of a particular object, that men can plunge with their own desires into the unceasing flow of changes and seize upon some object as their end, irrespective of everything else. The use of intelligence to discover the object that will best operate as a releasing and unifying stimulus in the existing situation is discounted. One reminds oneself that one's end is justice or charity or professional achievement or putting over a deal for a needed public improvement, and further questionings and qualms are stilled. It is customary to suppose that such methods merely ignore the question of the morality of the means which are used to secure the end desired. Common sense revolts against the maxim conveniently laid off upon Jesuits or other faraway people that the end justifies the means. There is no incorrectness in saying that the question of means employed is overlooked in such cases, but analysis would go further if it were also pointed out that overlooking means is only a device for failing to note those ends or consequences which, if they were noted, would be seen to be so evil that action would be stopped. Certainly nothing can justify or condemn means except ends, results. But we have to include consequences impartially. Even admitting that lying will save a man's soul, whatever that may mean, it would still be true that lying will have other consequences, namely the usual consequences that follow from tampering with good faith and that lead lying to be condemned. It is willful folly to fasten upon some single end or consequence which is liked, and permit the view of that to blot from perception all other undesired and undesirable consequences. It is like supposing that when a finger held close to the eye covers up a distant mountain, the finger is really larger than the mountain. Not the end, in singular, justifies the means, for there is no such thing as the single all-important end. To suppose that there is such an end is like working over again, in behalf of our private wishes, the miracle of Joshua in arresting the course of nature. It is not possible adequately to characterize the presumption, the falsity, and the deliberate perversion of intelligence involved in refusal to note the plural effects that flow from any act. A refusal adopted in order that we may justify an act by picking out the one consequence which will enable us to do what we wish to do and for which we feel the need of justification. Yet this assumption is continually made. It is made by implication in the current view of purposes or ends in view as object in themselves, instead of means to unification and liberation of present conflicting, confused habits and impulses. There is something almost sinister in the desire to label the doctrine that the end justifies the means with the name of some one obnoxious school. Politicians, especially if they have to do with the foreign affairs of a nation and are called statesmen, almost uniformly act upon the doctrine that the welfare of their own country justifies any measure irrespective of all the demoralization it works. Captains of industry, great executives in all lines, usually work upon this plan, but they are not the original offenders by any means. Every man works upon it so far as he permits himself to become so absorbed in one aspect of what he is doing that he loses a view of its varied consequences, hypnotizing his attention by consideration of just those consequences which in the abstract are desirable and slurring over other consequences equally real. Every man works on this principle who becomes over-interested in any cause or project, and who uses its desirability in the abstract to justify himself in employing any means that will assist him in arriving, ignoring all the collateral ends of his behavior. It is frequently pointed out that there is a type of executive man whose conduct seems to be as non-moral as the actions of the forces of nature. We all tend to relapse into this non-moral condition whenever we want any one thing intensely. In general, the identification of the end, prominent in conscious desire and effort, with the end is part of the technique of avoiding a reasonable survey of consequences. The survey is avoided because of a subconscious recognition that it would reveal desire in its true worth, and thus preclude action to satisfy it, or at all events give us an uneasy conscience in striving to realize it. Thus, the doctrine of the isolated, complete, or fixed end limits intelligent examination, encourages insincerity, and puts a pseudo-stamp of moral justification upon success at any price. Moralistic persons are given to escaping this evil by falling into another pit. They deny that consequences have anything at all to do with the morality of acts. Not ends, but motives, they say, justify or condemn acts. The thing to do, accordingly, is to cultivate certain motives or dispositions, benevolence, purity, love of perfection, and loyalty. The denial of consequences thus turns out formal, verbal. In reality, a consequence is set up at which to aim, only it is a subjective consequence. Meaning well is selected as the consequence or end to be cultivated at all hazards, an end which is all justifying, and to which everything else is offered up in sacrifice. The result is a sentimental, futile complacency rather than the brutal efficiency of the executive. But the root of both evils is the same. One man selects some external consequence, the other man a state of internal feeling to serve as the end. The doctrine of meaning well as the end is, if anything, the more contemptible of the two, for it shrinks from accepting any responsibility for actual results. It is negative, self-protective, and sloppy. It lends itself to complete self-deception. Why have men become so attached to fixed external ends? Why is it not universally recognized that an end is a device of intelligence in guiding action, and instrumental to freeing and harmonizing troubled and divided tendencies? The answer is virtually contained in what was earlier said about rigid habits and their effect upon intelligence. Ends are, in fact, literally endless, forever coming into existence as new activities occasion new consequences. Endless ends is a way of saying that there are no ends, that is, no fixed, self-enclosed finalities. While, however, we cannot actually prevent change from occurring, we can and do regard it as evil. We strive to retain action in ditches already dug. We regard novelties as dangerous, experiments as illicit, and deviations as forbidden. Fixed and separate ends reflect a projection of our own fixed and non-interacting compartmental habits. We see only consequences which correspond to our habitual courses. As we have said, men do not begin to shoot because there were ready-made targets to aim at. They made things into targets by shooting at them, and then made special targets to make shooting more significantly interesting. But if generation after generation were shown targets they had had no part in constructing, if bows and arrows were thrust into their hands, and pressure were brought to bear upon them to keep them shooting in season and out, some wearied soul would soon propound to willing listeners the theory that shooting was unnatural, that man was naturally wholly at rest, and that targets existed in order that men might be forced to be active, that the duty of shooting and the virtue of hitting are externally imposed and fostered, and that otherwise there would be no such thing as a shooting activity, that is, morality. The doctrine of fixed ends not only diverts attention from examination of consequences and the intelligent creation of purpose, but, since means and ends are two ways of regarding the same actuality, it also renders men careless in their inspection of existing conditions. An aim not framed on the basis of a survey of those present conditions which are to be employed as means of its realization simply throws us back upon past habits. We then do not do what we intended to do, but what we have got used to doing, or else we thrash about in a blind, ineffectual way. The result is failure. Discouragement follows, assuaged perhaps by the thought that in any case the end is too ideal, too noble and remote to be capable of realization. We fall back on the consoling thought that our moral ideals are too good for this world, and that we must accustom ourselves to a gap between aim and execution. Actual life is then thought of as compromise with the best, an enforced second or third best, a dreary exile from our true home in the ideal, or a temporary period of troubled probation to be followed by a period of unending attainment and peace. At the same time, as has been repeatedly pointed out, persons of a more practical turn of mind accept the world as it is, that is, as past customs have made it to be, and consider what advantages for themselves may be extracted from it. They form aims on the basis of existing habits of life which may be turned to their own private account. They employ intelligence in framing ends and selecting and arranging means. But intelligence is confined to manipulation. It does not extend to construction. It is the intelligence of the politician, administrator, and professional executive, the kind of intelligence which has given a bad meaning to a word that ought to have a fine meaning, opportunism. For the highest task of intelligence is to grasp and realize genuine opportunity or possibility. Roughly speaking, the course of forming aims is as follows. The beginning is with a wish, an emotional reaction against the present state of things, and a hope for something different. Action fails to connect satisfactorily with surrounding conditions. Thrown back upon itself, it projects itself in an imagination of a scene which, if it were present, would afford satisfaction. This picture is often called an aim, more often an ideal. But in itself it is a fancy which may be only a fantasy, a dream, a castle in the air. In itself it is a romantic embellishment of the present. At its best, it is material for poetry or the novel. Its natural home is not in the future, but in the dim past or in some distant and supposedly better part of the present world. Every such ideal object is suggested by something actually experienced, as the flight of birds suggests the liberation of human beings from the restrictions of slow locomotion on dull earth. It becomes an aim or end only when it is worked out in terms of concrete conditions available for its realization, that is, in terms of means. This transformation depends upon study of the conditions which generate or make possible the fact observed to exist already. The fancy of the delight of moving at will through the air became an actuality only after men carefully studied the way in which a bird, although heavier than air, actually sustains itself in air. A fancy becomes an aim, in short, when some past sequence of known cause and effect is projected into the future, and when, by assembling its causal conditions, we strive to generate a like result. We have to fall back upon what has already happened naturally without design, and study it to see how it happened, which is what is meant by causation. This knowledge, joined to wish, creates a purpose. Many men have doubtless dreamed of ability to have light in darkness without the trouble of oil, lamps, and friction. Glowworms, lightning, the sparks of cut electric conductors suggest such a possibility. But the picture remained a dream until an Edison studied all that could be found out about such causal phenomena of light, and then set to work to search out and gather together the means for reproducing their operation. The great trouble with what passes for moral ends and ideals is that they do not get beyond the stage of fancy of something agreeable and desirable based upon an emotional wish. Very often, at that, not even an original wish, but the wish of some leader which has been conventionalized and transmitted through channels of authority. Every gain in natural science makes possible new aims. That is, the discovery of how things do occur makes it possible to conceive of their happening at will, and gives us a start on selecting and combining the conditions, the means, to command their happening. In technical matters this lesson has been fairly well learned. But in moral matters, men still largely neglect the need of studying the way in which results similar to those which we desire actually happen. Mechanism is despised as of importance only in low material things. The consequent divorce of moral ends from scientific study of natural events renders the former impotent wishes compensatory dreams in consciousness. In fact, ends or consequences are still determined by fixed habit and the force of circumstance. The evils of idle dreaming and of routine are experienced in conjunction. Idealism must indeed come first. The imagination of some better state generated by desire. But unless ideals are to be dreams and idealism a synonym for romanticism and fantasy building, there must be a most realistic study of actual conditions and of the mode or law of natural events in order to give the imagined or ideal object definite form and solid substance, to give it, in short, practicality and constitute it a working end. The acceptance of fixed ends in themselves is an aspect of man's devotion to an ideal of certainty. This affection was inevitably cherished as long as men believed that the highest things in physical nature are at rest, and that science is possible only by grasping immutable forms and species. In other words, for much the greater part of the intellectual history of mankind. Only reckless skeptics would have dared entertain any idea of ends except as fixed in themselves as long as the whole structure of science was erected on the immobile. Behind, however, the conception of fixity, whether in science or morals, lay adherence to a certainty of truth, a clinging to something fixed, born of fear of the new or attachment to possessions. When the classicist condemns concession to impulse and holds up to admiration the patterns tested in tradition, he little suspects how much he is himself affected by unavowed impulses, timidity, which makes him cling to authority, conceit, which moves him to be himself the authority who speaks in the name of authority, and possessive impulse, which fears to risk acquisition in new adventures. Love of certainty is a demand for guarantees in advance of action. Ignoring the fact that truth can be bought only by the adventure of experiment, dogmatism turns truth into an insurance company. Fixed ends upon one side and fixed principles, that is the authoritative rules, on the other, are props for a feeling of safety, the refuge of the timid. The means by which the bold prey upon the timid. End of Part 3, Section 6. The Nature of Aims. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3. Section 7. The Nature of Principles. Desire for certainty, morals and probabilities, importance of generalizations. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. Intelligence is concerned with foreseeing the future so that action may have order and direction. It is also concerned with principles and criteria of judgment. The diffused or wide applicability of habits is reflected in the general character of principles. A principle is intellectually what a habit is for direct action. As habits set in grooves dominate activity and swerve it from conditions instead of increasing its adaptability, so principles, treated as fixed rules instead of helpful methods, take men away from experience. The more complicated the situation, and the less we really know about it, the more insistent is the orthodox type of moral theory upon the prior existence of some fixed and universal principle or law which is to be directly applied and followed. Ready-made rules available at a moment's notice for settling any kind of moral difficulty and resolving every species of moral doubt have been the chief object of the ambition of moralists. In the much less complicated and less changing matters of bodily health, such pretensions are known as quackery. But in morals, a hankering for certainty, born of timidity and nourished by love of authoritative prestige, has linked to the idea that absence of immutably fixed and universally applicable ready-made principles is equivalent to moral chaos. In fact, situations into which change and the unexpected enter are a challenge to intelligence to create new principles. Morals must be a growing science if it is to be a science at all, not merely because all truth has not yet been appropriated by the mind of man, but because life is a moving affair in which old moral truth ceases to apply. Principles are methods of inquiry and forecast which require verification by the event, and the time-honored effort to assimilate morals to mathematics is only a way of bolstering up an old dogmatic authority or putting a new one upon the throne of the old. But the experimental character of moral judgment does not mean complete uncertainty and fluidity. Principles exist as hypotheses with which to experiment. Human history is long. There is a long record of past experimentation in conduct, and there are cumulative verifications which give many principles a well-earned prestige. Lightly to disregard them is the height of foolishness. But social situations alter, and it is also foolish not to observe how old principles actually work under new conditions, and not to modify them so that they will be more effectual instruments in judging new cases. Many men are now aware of the harm done in legal matters by assuming the antecedent existence of fixed principles under which every new case may be brought. They recognize that this assumption merely puts an artificial premium on ideas developed under bygone conditions, and that their perpetuation in the present works inequity. Yet the choice is not between throwing away rules previously developed and sticking obstinately by them. The intelligent alternative is to revise, adapt, expand, and alter them. The problem is one of continuous, vital readaptation. The popular objection to casuistry is similar to the popular objection to the maxim that the end justifies the means. It is creditable to practical moral sense, but not to popular logical consistency. For recourse to casuistry is the only conclusion which can be drawn from belief in fixed universal principles, just as the Jesuit maxim is the only conclusion proper to be drawn from belief in fixed ends. Every act, every deed is individual. What is the sense of having fixed general rules, commandments, and laws, unless they are such as to confer upon individual cases of action, where alone instruction is finally needed, something of their own infallible certainty? Casuistry, so called, is simply the systematic effort to secure for particular instances of conduct the advantage of general rules which are asserted and believed in. By those who accept the notion of immutable regulating principles, casuistry ought to be lauded for sincerity and helpfulness, not depraised as it usually is. Or else men ought to carry back their aversion to manipulation of particular cases until they will fit into the Procrustean beds of fixed rules, to the point where it is clear that all principles are empirical generalizations from the ways in which previous judgments of conduct have practically worked out. When this fact is apparent, these generalizations will be seen to be not fixed rules for deciding doubtful cases, but instrumentalities for their investigation, methods by which the net value of past experience is rendered available for present scrutiny of new perplexities. Then it will also follow that they are hypotheses to be tested and revised by their further working. Footnote 8. Among contemporary moralists, Mr. G. E. Moore may be cited as almost alone in having the courage of the convictions shared by many. He insists that it is the true business of moral theory to enable men to arrive at precise and sure judgments in concrete cases of moral perplexity. End of footnote. Every such statement meets with prompt objection. We are told that in deliberation rival goods present themselves. We are faced by competing desires and ends which are incompatible with one another. They are all attractive and seductive. How then shall we choose among them? We can choose rationally among values, the argument continues, only if we have some fixed measure of values, just as we decide the respective lengths of physical things by recourse to the fixed foot rule. One might reply that after all there is no fixed foot rule, no fixed foot in itself, and that the standard length or weight of measure is only another special portion of matter, subject to change from heat, moisture, and gravitational position, defined only by conditions and relations. One might reply that the foot rule is a tool which has been worked out in actual prior comparisons of concrete things for the use in facilitating further comparisons. But we content ourselves with remarking that we find in this conception of a fixed antecedent standard another manifestation of the desire to escape the strain of the actual moral situation, its general uncertainty of possibilities and consequences. We are confronted with another case of the all too human love of certainty, a case of the wish for an intellectual patent issued by authority. The issue, after all, is one of fact. The critic is not entitled to enforce against the facts his private wish for a ready-made standard, which will relieve him from the burden of examination, observation, and continuing generalization and test. The worth of this private wish is moreover open to question in the light of the history of the development of natural science. There was a time when in astronomy, chemistry, and biology, men claimed that the judgment of individual phenomena was possible only because the mind was already in possession of fixed truths, universal principles, and preordained axioms. Only by their means could contingent, varying, particular events be truly known. There was, it was argued, no way to judge the truth of any particular statement about a particular plant, heavenly body, or case of combustion, unless there was a general truth already in hand with which to compare a particular empirical occurrence. The contention was successful. That is, for a long time it maintained its hold upon men's minds. But its effect was merely to encourage intellectual laziness, reliance upon authority, and blind acceptance of conceptions that had somehow become traditional. The actual advance of science did not begin till men broke away from this method. When men insisted on judging astronomical phenomena by bringing them directly under established truths, those of geometry, they had no astronomy, but only a private aesthetic construction. Astronomy began when men trusted themselves to embarking upon the uncertain seas of events and were willing to be instructed by changes in the concrete. The antecedent principles were tentatively employed as methods for conducting observations and experiments, and for organizing special facts as hypotheses. In morals now, as in physical science then, the work of intelligence in reaching such relative certainty or tested probability as is open to man is retarded by the false notion of fixed antecedent truths. Prejudice is confirmed. Rules formed accidentally or under the pressure of conditions long past are protected from criticism and thus perpetuated. Every group and person vested with authority strengthens possessed power by harping upon the sacredness of immutable principle. Moral facts, that is, the concrete careers of special courses of action, are not studied. There is no counterpart to clinical medicine. Rigid classifications forced upon facts are relied upon, and all is done, as it used to be done in natural science, in praise of reason and in fear of the variety and fluctuations of actual happenings. The hypothesis that each moral situation is unique, and that consequently general moral principles are instrumental to developing the individualized meaning of situations, is declared to be anarchic. It is said to be ethical atomism, pulverizing the order and dignity of morals. The question, again, is not what our inherited habits lead us to prefer, but where the facts take us. But in this instance, the facts do not take us into atomism and anarchy. These things are specters seen by the critic when he is suddenly confused by the loss of customary spectacles. He takes his own confusion, due to loss of artificial aids, for an objective situation. Because situations in which deliberation is evoked are new, and therefore unique, general principles are needed. Only an uncritical vagueness will assume that the sole alternative to fixed generality is absence of continuity. Rigid habits insist upon duplication, repetition, and recurrence. In their case, there is accordingly fixed principles. Only there is no principle at all. That is, no conscious intellectual rule, for thought is not needed. But all habit has continuity, and while a flexible habit does not secure in its operation bare recurrence nor absolute assurance, neither does it plunge us into the hopeless confusion of the absolutely different. To insist upon change and the new is to insist upon alteration of the old. In denying that the meaning of any genuine case of deliberation can be exhausted by treating it as a mere case of an established classification, the value of classification is not denied. It is shown where its value lies, namely in directing attention to resemblances and differences in the new case, in economizing effort in foresight. To call a generalization a tool is not to say it is useless. The contrary is patently the case. A tool is something to use, hence it is also something to be improved by noting how it works. The need of such noting and improving is indispensable if, as is the case with moral principles, the tool has to be used in unwanted circumstances. Continuity of growth, not atomism, is thus the alternative to fixity of principles and aims. This is no Bergsonian plea for dividing the universe into two portions, one all of fixed recurring habits and the other all spontaneity of flux. Only in such a universe would reason in morals have to take its choice between absolute fixity and absolute looseness. Nothing is more instructive about the genuine value of generalization in conduct than the errors of Kant. He took the doctrine that the essence of reason is complete universality, and hence necessity and immutability, with the seriousness becoming the professor of logic. Applying the doctrine to morality, he saw that this conception severed morals from connection with experience. Other moralists had gone that far before his day, but none of them had done what Kant proceeded to do: carry this separation of moral principles and ideals from experience to its logical conclusion. He saw that to exclude from principles all connection with empirical details meant to exclude all reference of any kind to consequences. He then saw with a clearness which does his logic credit that with such exclusion reason becomes entirely empty. Nothing is left except the universality of the universal. He was then confronted by the seemingly insoluble problem of getting moral instruction regarding special cases out of a principle that, having forsworn intercourse with experience, was barren and empty. His ingenious method was as follows. Formal universality means at least logical identity. It means self-consistency or absence of contradiction. Hence follows the method by which a would-be truly moral agent will proceed in judging the rightness of any proposed act. He will ask, can its motive be made universal for all cases? How would one like it if by one's act, one's motive in that act were to be erected into a universal law of actual nature? Would one then be willing to make the same choice? Surely a man would hesitate to steal if by his choice to make stealing the motive of his act, he were also to erect it into such a fixed law of nature that henceforth he and everybody else would always steal whenever property was in question. No stealing without property, and with universal stealing also no property. A clear self-contradiction. Looked at in the light of reason, every mean, insincere, inconsiderate motive of action shrivels into a private exception which a person wants to take advantage of in his own favor, and which he would be horrified to have others act upon. It violates the great principle of logic, that A is A. Kindly, decent acts, on the contrary, extend and multiply themselves in a continuing harmony. This treatment by Kant evinces deep insight into the office of intelligence and principle in conduct. But it involves flat contradiction of Kant's own original intention to exclude consideration of concrete consequences. It turns out to be a method of recommending a broad, impartial view of consequences. Our forecast of consequences is always subject, as we have noted, to the bias of impulse and habit. We see what we want to see, we obscure what is unfavorable to a cherished, probably unavowed wish. We dwell upon favoring circumstances till they become weighted with reinforcing considerations. We don't give opposing consequences half a chance to develop in thought. Deliberation needs every possible help it can get against the twisting, exaggerating, and slighting tendency of passion and habit. To form the habit of asking how we should be willing to be treated in a similar case, which is what Kant's maxim amounts to, is to gain an ally for impartial and sincere deliberation and judgment. It is a safeguard against our tendency to regard our own case as exceptional in comparison with the case of others. Just this once, a plea for isolation. Secrecy, a plea for non-inspection, are forces which operate in every passionate desire. Demand for consistency, for universality, far from implying a rejection of all consequences, is a demand to survey consequences broadly and to link effect to effect in a chain of continuity. Whatever forces work to this end is reason. For reason, let it be repeated, is an outcome, a function, not a primitive force. What we need are those habits and dispositions which lead to impartial and consistent foresight of consequences. Then our judgments are reasonable. We are then reasonable creatures. End of Part 3, Section 7. The Nature of Principles. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 8. Desire and Intelligence, dealing with object and consequence of desire, desire and quiescence, self-deception in desire, desire needs intelligence, nature of idealism, living in the ideal. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. Certain critics, in sympathy with at least the negative contention, the critical side, of such a theory as has been advanced, regard it as placing too much emphasis upon intelligence. They find it intellectualistic, cold-blooded. They say we must change desire, love, aspiration, and admiration, and then action will be transformed. A new affection, a changed appreciation, brings with it a revaluation of life and insists upon its realization. A refinement of intellect at most only figures out better ways of reaching old and accustomed ends. In fact, we are lucky if intellect does not freeze the ardor of generous desire and paralyze creative endeavor. Intellect is critical, unproductive, while desire is generative. In its dispassionateness, intellect is aloof from humanity and its needs. It fosters detachment where sympathy is needed. It cultivates contemplation when salvation lies in liberating desire. Intellect is analytic, taking things to pieces. Its devices are the scalpel and test tube. Affection is synthetic, unifying. This argument affords an opportunity for making more explicit those respective offices of wish and thought in forming ends which have already been touched upon. First, we must undertake an independent analysis of desire. It is customary to describe desires in terms of their objects, meaning by objects the things which figure as in imagination their goals. As the object is noble or base, so it is thought is desire. In any case, emotions rise and cluster about the object. This stands out so conspicuously in immediate experience that it monopolizes the central position in the traditional psychological theory of desire. Barring gross self-deception or the frustration of external circumstance, the outcome or end result of desire is regarded by this theory as similar to the end in view or object consciously desired. Such, however, is not the case, as readily appears from the analysis of deliberation. In saying that the actual outcome of desire is different in kind from the object upon which desire consciously fastens, I do not mean to repeat the old complaint about the fallibility and feebleness of mortals, in virtue of which man's hopes are frustrated and twisted in realization. The difference is one of diverse dimensions, not of degree or amount. The object desired and the attainment of desire are no more alike than a signboard on the road is like the garage to which it points and which it recommends to the traveler. Desire is the forward urge of living creatures. When the push and drive of life meets no obstacle, there is nothing which we call desire. There is just life activity. But obstructions present themselves and activity is dispersed and divided. Desire is the outcome. It is activity surging forward to break through what dams it up. The object, which then presents itself in thought as the goal of desire, is the object of the environment which, if it were present, would secure a reunification of activity and the restoration of its ongoing unity. The end in view of desire is that object which, if it were present, would link into an organized whole activities which are now partial and competing. It is no more like the actual end of desire, or the resulting state attained, than the coupling of cars which have been separated is like an ongoing single train. Yet the train cannot go on without the coupling. Such statements may seem contrary to common sense. The pertinency of the illustration used will be denied. No man desires the signboard which he sees. He desires the garage, the objective, the ulterior thing. But does he? Or is the garage simply a means by which a divided body of activities is redintegrated or coordinated? Is it desired in any sense for itself, or only because it is the means of effective adjustment of a whole set of underlying habits? While common sense responds to the ordinary statement of the end of desire, It also responds to a statement that no one desires the object for its own sake, but only for what can be got out of it. Here is just the point at which the theory that pleasure is the real objective of desire makes its appeal. It points out that not the physical object, nor even its possession, is really wanted, that they are only means to something personal and experiential. And hence it is argued that they are means to pleasure. The present hypothesis offers an alternative. It says that they are means of removal of obstructions to the ongoing unified system of activities. It is easy to see why an objective looms so large, and why emotional surge and stress gather about it and lift it high above the floor of consciousness. The objective is, or is taken to be, the key to the situation. If we can attain it, lay hold of it, the trick is turned. It is like the piece of paper which carries the reprieve a condemned man waits for. Issues of life hang on it. The desired object is in no sense the end or goal of desire, but it is the sine qua non of that end. A practical man will fix his attention upon it, and not dream about eventualities which are only dreams if the objective is not attained, but will follow in their own natural course if it is reached. For then it becomes a factor in the system of activities. Hence the truth in the various so-called paradoxes of desire. If pleasure or perfection were the true end of desire, it would still be true that the way to attain it is not to think of them. For object thought of and object achieved exist in different dimensions. In addition to the popular notions that either the object in view or else pleasure is the end of desire, there is a less popular theory that quiescence is the actual outcome or true terminal of desire. The theory finds its most complete practical statement in Buddhism. It is nearer the psychological truth than either of the other notions. But it views the attained outcome simply in its negative aspect. The end reached quiets the clash and removes the discomfort attendant upon divided and obstructed activity. The uneasiness, unrest, characteristics of desire is put to sleep. For this reason, some persons resort to intoxicants and anodynes. If quiescence were the end and it could be perpetuated, this way of removing disagreeable uneasiness would be as satisfactory a way out as the way of objective effort. But in fact, desire satisfied does not bring quiescence unqualifiedly, but that kind of quiescence which marks the recovery of unified activity, the absence of internal strife among habits and instincts. Equilibration of activities rather than quiescence is the actual result of satisfied desire. This names the outcome positively rather than comparatively and negatively. This disparity of dimensions in desire between the object thought of and the outcome reached is the explanation of those self-deceptions which psychoanalysis has brought home to us so forcefully, but of which it gives elaborately cumbrous accounts. The object thought of and the outcome never agree. There is no self-deceit in this fact. What then really happens when the actual outcome of satisfied revenge figures in thought as virtuous eagerness for justice, or when the tickled vanity of social admiration is masked as pure love of learning? The trouble lies in the refusal of a person to note the quality of the outcome, not in the unavoidable disparity of desire's object and the outcome. The honest or integral mind attends to the result and sees what it really is. For no terminal condition is exclusively terminal. Since it exists in time, it has consequences as well as antecedents. In being a consummation, it is also a force having causal potentialities. It is initial as well as terminal. Self-deception originates in looking at an outcome in one direction only, as a satisfaction of what has gone before, ignoring the fact that what is attained is a state of habits which will continue in action and which will determine future results. Outcomes of desire are also beginnings of new acts, and hence are portentous. Satisfied revenge may feel like justice vindicated. The prestige of learning may feel like an enlargement and rectification of an objective outlook. But since different instincts and habits have entered into them, they are actually, that is dynamically, unlike. The function of moral judgment is to detect this unlikeness. Here again, the belief that we can know ourselves immediately is as disastrous to moral science as the corresponding idea regarding knowledge of nature was to physical science. Obnoxious subjectivity of moral judgments is due to the fact that the immediate or aesthetic quality swells and displaces the thought of the active potency which gives activity its moral quality. We are all natural Jack Horners. If the plum comes when we put in and pull out our thumb, we attribute the satisfactory result to personal virtue. The plum is obtained, and it is not easy to distinguish obtaining from attaining, acquisition from achieving. Jack Horner, Esquire, put forth some effort, and results and efforts are always more or less incommensurate. For the result is always dependent to some extent upon the favor or disfavor of circumstance. Why then should not the satisfactory plum shed its halo retrospectively upon what precedes, and be taken as a sign of virtue? In this way, heroes and leaders are constructed. Such is the worship of success. And the evil of success worship is precisely the evil with which we have been dealing. Success is never merely final or terminal. Something else succeeds it, and its successors are influenced by its nature, that is, by the persisting habits and impulses that enter into it. The world does not stop when the successful person pulls out his plum, nor does he stop in the kind of success he obtains, and his attitude toward it is a factor in what comes afterward. By a strange turn of the wheel, the success of the ultra-practical man is psychologically like the refined enjoyment of the ultra-aesthetic person. Both ignore the eventualities with which every state of experience is charged. There is no reason for not enjoying the present, but there is every reason for examination of the objective factors of what is enjoyed before we translate enjoyment into a belief in excellence. There is every reason, in other words, for cultivating another enjoyment, that of the habit of examining the productive potentialities of the objects enjoyed. Analysis of desire thus reveals the falsity of theories which magnify it at the expense of intelligence. Impulse is primary, and intelligence is secondary and in some sense derivative. There should be no blinking of this fact, but recognition of it as a fact exalts intelligence. For thought is not the slave of impulse to do its bidding. Impulse does not know what it is after. It cannot give orders, not even if it wants to. It rushes blindly into any opening it chances to find, anything that expends it or satisfies it. One outlet is like another to it. It is indiscriminate. Its vagaries and excesses are the stock theme of classical moralists. And while they point the wrong moral in urging the abdication of impulse in favor of reason, their characterization of impulse is not wholly wrong. What intelligence has to do in the service of impulse is to act not as its obedient servant, but as its clarifier and liberator. And this can be accomplished only by a study of the conditions and causes, the workings and consequences of the greatest possible variety of desires and combinations of desire. Intelligence converts desire into plans, systematic plans based on assembling facts, reporting events as they happen, keeping tab on them, and analyzing them. Nothing is so easy to fool as impulse, and no one is deceived so readily as the person under strong emotion. Hence the idealism of man is easily brought to naught. Generous impulses are aroused. There is a vague anticipation, a burning hope, of a marvelous future. Old things are to pass speedily away, and new heavens and earth are to come into existence. But impulse burns itself up. Emotion cannot be kept at its full tide. Obstacles are encountered upon which action dashes itself into ineffectual spray. Or if it achieves by luck a transitory success, it is intoxicated and plumes itself on victory while it is on the road to sudden defeat. Meantime, other men, not carried away by impulse, use established habits and a shrewd, cold intellect that manipulates them. The outcome is the victory of baser desire, directed by insight and cunning, over generous desire, which does not know its way. The realistic man of the world has evolved a regular technique for dealing with idealistic outbursts that threaten his supremacy. His aims are low, but he knows the means by which they are to be executed. His knowledge of conditions is narrow, but it is effective within its confines. His foresight is limited to results that concern personal success, but is sharp and clear-cut. He has no great difficulty in drafting the idealistic desire of others, with its vague enthusiasm and its cloudy perceptions, into canals where it will serve his own purposes. The energies excited by emotional idealism run into the materialistic reservoirs provided by the contriving thought of those who have not surrendered their minds to their sentiment. The glorification of affection and aspiration at the expense of thought is a survival of romantic optimism. It assumes a pre-established harmony between natural impulse and natural objects. Only such a harmony justifies the belief that generous feeling will find its way, illuminated by the sheer nobility of its own quality. Persons of a literary turn of mind are as subject to this fallacy as intellectual specialists are apt to the contrary fallacy, that theorizing apart from force of impulse and habit will get affairs forward. They tend to fancy that things are as pliant to imagination as are words, that emotion can compose affairs as if they were materials for a lyric poem. But if the objects of the environment were only as plastic as the materials of poetic art, men would never have been obliged to have recourse to creation in the medium of words. We idealize in fancy because our idealizations, in fact, are balked. And while the latter must start with imaginative idealizations instigated by release of generous impulse, they can be carried through only when the hard labor of observation, memory, and foresight wedge the vision of imagination to the organized efficiencies of habit. Sometimes desire means not bare impulse, but impulse which has sense of an objective. In this case, desire and thought cannot be opposed, for desire includes thought within itself. The question is now how far the work of thought has been done, and how adequate is its perception of its directing object. For the moving force may be a shadowy presentiment constructed by wishful hope rather than by study of conditions. It may be an emotional indulgence rather than a solid plan built upon the rocks of actuality discovered by accurate inquiries. There is no thought without the impeding of impulse. But the obstruction may merely intensify its blind surge forward, or it may divert the force of forward impulse into observation of existing conditions and forecast their future consequences. This long way around is the short way home for desire. No issue of morals is more far-reaching than the one herewith sketched. Historically speaking, there is point in the attacks of those who speak slightingly of science and intellect, and who would limit their moral significance to supplying incidental help to execution of purposes born of affection. Thought, too often, is specialized in a remote and separate pursuit, or employed in a hard way to contrive the instrumentalities of success. Intellect is too often made a tool for systemized apology for things as they are, that is, for customs that benefit the class in power, or else a road to an interesting occupation which accumulates facts and ideas as other men gather dollars, while priding itself on its ideal quality. No wonder that at times catastrophes that affect men in common are welcomed. For the moment they turn science away from its abstract technicalities into a servant of some human aspiration, the hard, chilly calculations of intellect are swept away by floods of sympathy and common loyalties. But, alas, emotion without thought is unstable. It rises like the tide and subsides like the tide, irrespective of what it has accomplished. It is easily diverted into any side channel dug by old habits, or provided by cool cunning, or it disperses itself aimlessly. Then comes the reaction of disillusionment, and men turn all the more fiercely to the pursuit of narrow ends where they are habituated to use observation and planning, and where they have acquired some control of conditions. The separation of warm emotion and cool intelligence is the great moral tragedy. This division is perpetuated by those who deprecate science and foresight in behalf of affection, as it is by those who, in the name of an idol labeled reason, would quench passion. The intellect is always inspired by some impulse. Even the most case-hardened scientific specialist or the most abstract philosopher is moved by some passion. But an actuating impulse easily hardens into isolated habit. It is unavowed and disconnected. The remedy is not lapse of thought, but its quickening and extension to contemplate the continuities of existence, and to restore the connection of the isolated desire to the companionship of its fellows. The glorification of will, apart from thought, turns out either to a commitment to blind action, which serves the purpose of those who guide their deeds by narrow plans, or else a sentimental, romantic faith in the harmonies of nature, leading straight to disaster. In words, at least, the association of idealism with emotion and impulse has been repeatedly implied in the foregoing. The connection is more than verbal. Every end that man holds up, every project he entertains, is ideal. It marks something wanted rather than something existing. It is wanted because existence, as it now is, does not furnish it. It carries itself, then, a sense of contrast to the achieved, to the existent. It outruns the seen and touched. It is the work of faith and hope, even when it is the plan of the most hard-headed, practical man. But though ideal in this sense, it is not an ideal. Common sense revolts at calling every project, every design, every contrivance of cunning ideal, because common sense includes above all in its conception of the ideal the quality of the plan proposed. Idealistic revolt is blind, and like every blind reaction sweeps us away. The quality of the ideal is exalted till it is something beyond all possibility of definite plan and execution. Its sublimity renders it inaccessibly remote. An ideal becomes a synonym for whatever is inspiring and impossible. Then, since intelligence cannot be wholly suppressed, the ideal is hardened by thought into some high, faraway object. It is so elevated and so distant that it does not belong to this world or to experience. It is, in technical language, transcendental. In common speech, supernatural, of heaven, not earth. The ideal is then a goal of final, exhaustive, comprehensive perfection, which can be defined only by complete contrast with the actual. Although impossible of realization and of conception, it is still regarded as the source of all generous discontent with actualities and of all inspiration to progress. This notion of the nature and office of ideals combines in one contradictory whole all that is vicious in the separation of desire and thought. It strives, while retaining the vagueness of emotion, to simulate the objective definiteness of thought. It follows the natural course of intelligence in demanding an object which will unify and fulfill desire, and then cancels the work of thought by treating the object as ineffable and unrelated to present action and experience. It converts the surge of present impulse into a future end, only to swamp the endeavor to clarify this end in a gush of unconsidered feeling. It is supposed that the thought of the ideal is necessary to arouse dissatisfaction with the present and to arouse effort to change it. But in reality, the ideal is itself the product of discontent with conditions. Instead, however, of serving to organize and redirect effort, it operates as a compensatory dream. It becomes another ready-made world. Instead of promoting effort at concrete transformations of what exists, it constitutes another kind of existence already somewhere in being. It is a refuge, an asylum from effort. Thus the energy that might be spent in transforming present ills goes into oscillating flights into a faraway perfect world, and the tedium of enforced returns into the necessities of the present evil world. We can recover the genuine import of ideals and idealism only by disentangling this unreal mixture of thought and emotion. The action of deliberation, as we have seen, consists in selecting some foreseen consequence to serve as the stimulus to present action. It brings future possibilities into the present scene and thereby frees and expands present tendencies. But the selected consequence is set in an indefinite context of other consequences just as real as it is, and many of them much more certain, in fact. The ends that are foreseen and utilized mark out a little island in an infinite sea. This limitation would be fatal were the proper function of ends anything else than to liberate and guide present action out of its perplexities and confusions. But this service constitutes the sole meaning of aims and purposes. Hence, their slight extent in comparison with ignored and unforeseen consequences is of no import in itself. The ideal, as it stands in popular thought, the notion of a complete and exhaustive realization, is remote from the true functions of ends and would only embarrass us if it could be embraced in thought instead of being, as it is, a comment by the emotions. For the sense of an indefinite context of consequences, from among which the aim is selected, enters into the present meaning of activity. The end is the figured pattern at the center of the field through which runs the axis of conduct. About this central configuration extends infinitely a supporting background in a vague whole, undefined and undiscriminated. At most, intelligence but throws a spotlight on that little part of the whole which marks out the axis of movement. Even if the light is flickering and the illuminated portion stands forth only dimly from the shadowy background, it suffices if we are shown the way to move. To the rest of the consequences, collateral and remote, corresponds a background of feeling, of diffused emotion. This forms the stuff of the ideal. From the standpoint of its definite aim, any act is petty in comparison with the totality of natural events. What is accomplished directly as the outcome of a turn, which our action gives the course of events, is infinitesimal in comparison with their total sweep. Only an illusion of conceit persuades us that cosmic difference hangs upon even our wisest and most strenuous effort. Yet discontent with this limitation is as unreasonable as relying upon an illusion of external importance to keep ourselves going. In a genuine sense, every act is already possessed of infinite import. The little part of the scheme of affairs which is modifiable by our efforts is continuous with the rest of the world. The boundaries of our garden plot join it to the world of our neighbors and our neighbors' neighbors. That small effort which we can put forth is in turn connected with an infinity of events that sustain and support it. The consciousness of this encompassing infinity of connections is ideal. When a sense of the infinite reach of an act, physically occurring in a small point in space and occupying a petty instant of times, comes home to us, the meaning of the present act is seen to be vast, immeasurable, and unthinkable. This ideal is not a goal to be attained. It is a significance to be felt and appreciated. Though consciousness of it cannot become intellectualized, identified in objects of a distinct character, yet emotional appreciation of it is won only by those willing to think. It is the office of art and religion to evoke such appreciations and intimations, to enhance and study them till they are wrought into the texture of our lives. Some philosophers define religious consciousness as beginning where moral and intellectual consciousness leave off, in the sense that definite purposes and methods shade off of necessity into a vast whole which is incapable of objective presentation. This view is correct. But they have falsified the conception by treating the religious consciousness as something that comes after an experience in which striving, resolution, and foresight are found. To them, morality and science are a striving. When striving ceases, a moral holiday begins, an excursion beyond the utmost flight of legitimate thought and endeavor. But there is a point in every intelligent activity where effort ceases, where thought and doing fall back upon a course of events which effort and reflection cannot touch. There is a point in deliberate action where definite thought fades into the ineffable and undefinable, into emotion. if the sense of this effortless and unfathomable whole comes only in alternation with the sense of strain in action and labor in thought, then we spend our lives in oscillating between what is cramped and enforced and a brief transitory escape. The function of religion is then caricatured rather than realized. Morals, like war, is thought of as hell, and religion, like peace, as a respite. The religious experience is a reality insofar as in the midst of effort to foresee and regulate future objects, we are sustained and expanded in feebleness and failure by the sense of an enveloping whole. Peace in action, not after it, is the contribution of the ideal to conduct. End of Part 3, Section 8, Desire and Intelligence. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 3, Section 9, The Present and Future, dealing with subordination of activity to result, control of the future, production and consummation, idealism and distant goals. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. Over and over again, one point has recurred for criticism: the subordination of activity to a result outside itself. Whether that goal be thought of as pleasure, as virtue, as perfection, as vital enjoyment of salvation, it is secondary to the fact that the moralists who have asserted fixed ends have, in all their differences from one another, agreed in the basic idea that present activity is but a means. We have insisted that happiness, reasonableness, virtue, and perfecting are, on the contrary, parts of the present significance of present action. Memory of the past, observation of the present, foresight of the future are indispensable, but they are indispensable to a present liberation, an enriching growth of action. Happiness is fundamental in morals only because happiness is not something to be sought for, but is something now attained even in the midst of pain and trouble, whenever recognition of our ties with nature and with fellow men releases and informs our action. Reasonableness is a necessity because it is the perception of the continuities that take action out of its immediateness and isolation into connection with the past and future. Perhaps the criticism and insistence have been too incessant. They may have provoked the reader to reaction. He may readily conclude that orthodox theories have been one-sided in sacrificing the present to the future good, making of the present but an onerous obligation or a sacrifice endured for future gain. But why, he may protest, go to an opposite extreme and make the future but a means to the significance of the present? Why should the power of foresight and effort to shape the future and to regulate what is to happen be slighted? Is not the effect of such a doctrine to weaken putting forth of endeavor in order to make the future better than the present? Control of the future may be limited in extent, but it is correspondingly precious. We should jealously cherish whatever encourages and sustains effort to that end. To make little of this possibility, in effect, it will be argued, is to decrease the care and endeavor upon which progress depends. Control of the future is indeed precious in exact proportion to its difficulty and its moderate degree of attainability. Anything that actually tends to make that control less than it now is would be a movement backward into sloth and triviality. But there is a difference between future improvement as a result and as a direct aim. To make it an aim is to throw away the surest means of attaining it, namely attention to the full use of present resources in the present situation. Forecast of future conditions and scientific study of past and present, in order that the forecast may be intelligent, are indeed necessities. Concentration of intellectual concern upon the future and solicitude for scope and precisions of estimate, characteristic of any well-conducted affair, naturally give the impression that their animating purpose is control of the future. But thought about future happenings is the only way we can judge the present. It is the only way to appraise its significance. Without such projection, there can be no projects, no plans for administering present energies and overcoming present obstacles. Deliberately to subordinate the present to the future is to subject the comparatively secure to the precarious, exchange resources for liabilities, surrender what is under control to what is relatively incapable of control. The amount of control which will come into existence in the future is not within control, but such an amount as turns out to be practicable accrues only in consequence of the best possible management of present means and obstacles. Dominating intellectual preoccupation with the future is the way by which efficiency in dealing with the present is attained. It is a way, not a goal. And upon the very most hopeful outlook, study and planning are more important in the meaning, the enrichment of content, which they add to present activity, than is the increase of external control they effect. Nor is this doctrine passivistic in tendency. What sense is there in increased external control except to increase the intrinsic significance of living? The future that is foreseen is a future that has some time to be a present. Is the value of that present also to be postponed to a future date, and so on indefinitely? Or, if the good we are struggling to attain in the future is one to be actually realized, when that future becomes present, why should not the good of this present be equally precious? And is there, again, any intelligent way of modifying the future except to attend to the full possibilities of the present? Scamping the present in behalf of the future leads only to rendering the future less manageable. It increases the probability of molestation by future events. Remarks cast in this form probably seem too much like a logical manipulation of the concepts of present and future to be convincing. Building a house is a typical instance of an intelligent activity. It is an activity directed by a plan, a design. The plan is itself based upon a foresight of future uses. This foresight is in turn dependent upon an organized survey of past experiences and of present conditions, a recollection of former experiences of living in houses, and an acquaintance with present materials, prices, resources, etc. Now, if a legitimate case of subordination of present to regulation of the future may anywhere be found, it is in such a case as this. For a man usually builds a house for the sake of the comfort and security, the control thereby afforded to future living, rather than just for the fun or the trouble of building. If in such a case inspection shows that, after all, intellectual concern with the past and future is for the sake of directing present activity and giving it meaning, the conclusion may be accepted for other cases. Note that the present activity is the only one really under control. The man may die before the house is built, or his financial conditions may change, or he may need to remove to another place. If he attempts to provide for all contingencies, he will never do anything. If he allows his attention to be much distracted by them, he won't do well his present planning and execution. The more he considers the future uses to which the house will probably be put, the better he will do his present job, which is the activity of building. Control of future living, such as that may turn out to be, is fully dependent upon taking his present activity seriously and devotedly as an end, not as a means. And a man has his hands full in doing well what now needs to be done. Until men have formed the habit of using intelligence fully as a guide to present action, they will never find out how much control of future contingencies is possible. As things are, men so habitually scamp the present action in behalf of future ends that the facts for estimating the extent of the possibility of reduction of future contingencies have not been disclosed. What a man is doing limits both his direct control and his responsibility. We must not confuse the act of building with the house when built. The latter is a means, not a fulfillment, but it is such only because it enters into a new activity which is present, not future. Life is continuous. The act of building in time gives way to the acts connected with a domicile. But everywhere the good, the fulfillment, the meaning of activity resides in a present made possible by judging existing conditions in their connections. If we seek for an illustration on a larger scale, education furnishes us with a poignant example. As traditionally conducted, it strikingly exhibits a subordination of the living present to a remote and precarious future. To prepare, to get ready, is its keynote. The actual outcome is lack of adequate preparation, of intelligent adaptation. The professed exaltation of the future turns out in practice to be a blind following of tradition, a rule of thumb muddling along from day to day, or, as in some of the projects called industrial education, a determined effort on the part of one class of the community to secure its future at the expense of another class. If education were conducted as a process of fullest utilization of present resources, liberating and guiding capacities that are now urgent, it goes without saying that the lives of the young would be much richer in meaning than they are now. It also follows that intelligence would be kept busy in studying all indications of power, all obstacles and perversions, all products of the past that throw light upon the present capacity, and in foreseeing the future career of impulse and habit now active, not for the sake of subordinating the latter, but in order to treat them intelligently. As a consequence, whatever fortification and expansion of the future that is possible will be achieved, as it is now, dismally unattained. The more complicated instance is found in the dominant quality of our industrial activity. It may be dogmatically declared that the roots of its evils are found in the separation of production from consumption, that is, actual consummation or fulfillment. A normal case of the relationship is found in the taking of food. Food is consumed and vigor is produced. The difference between the two is one of directions or dimensions distinguished by intellect. In reality, there is simply conversion of energy from one form to another, wherein it is more available, of greater significance. The activity of the artist, the sportsman, the scientific inquirer exemplifies the same balance. Activity should be productive. That is to say, it should have a bearing on the future, should affect control of it. But so far as a productive action is intrinsically creative, It has its own intrinsic value. Reference to future products and future enjoyments is but a way of enhancing perception of an imminent meaning. A skilled artisan who enjoys his work is aware that what he is making is made for future use. Externally, his action is one technically labeled production. It seems to illustrate the subjection of present activity to remote ends, but actually, morally, psychologically, the sense of the utility of the article produced is a factor in the present significance of action, due to the present utilization of abilities, giving play to taste and skill, accomplishing something now. The moment production is severed from immediate satisfaction, it becomes labor, drudgery, a task reluctantly performed. Yet the whole tendency of modern economic life has been to assume that consumption will take care of itself, provided that only production is grossly and intensely attended to. Making things is frantically accelerated, and every mechanical device used to swell the senseless bulk. As a result, most workers find no replenishment, no renewal and growth of mind, no fulfillment in work. They labor to get mere means of later satisfaction. This, when procured, is isolated, in turn, from production. It is reduced to a barren physical affair or a sensuous compensation for normal goods denied. Meantime, the fatuity of severing productions from consumption, from present enriching of life, is made evident by economic crises, by periods of unemployment alternating with periods of exercise, work, or overproduction. Production apart from fulfillment becomes purely a matter of quantity. For distinction, quality, is a matter of present meaning. Aesthetic elements being excluded, the mechanical reign. Production lacks criteria. One thing is better than another if it can be made faster or in greater mass. Leisure is not the nourishment of mind in work, nor a recreation. It is a feverish hurry for diversion, excitement, or display. Otherwise there is no leisure, except a sodden torpor. Fatigue, due for some to monotony and for others to overstrain in maintaining the pace, is inevitable. Socially, the separation of production and consumption, means and ends, is the root of the most profound division of classes. Those who fix the ends for production are in control. Those who engage in isolated productive activity are the subject class. But if the latter are oppressed, the former are not truly free. Their consumptions are accidental ostentation and extravagance, not a normal consummation or fulfillment of activity. The remainder of their lives is spent in enslavement to keeping the machinery going at an increasingly rapid rate. Meanwhile, class struggle grows between those whose productive labor is enforced by necessity and those who are privileged consumers. And the exaggeration of production, due to its isolation from ignored consumption, so hypnotizes attention that even would-be reformers, like Marxian socialists, assert that the entire social problem focuses at the point of production. Since this separation of means from ends signifies an erection of means into ends, it is no wonder that a materialistic conception of history emerges. It is not an invention of Marx. It is a record of fact so far as the separation in question obtains. For practicable idealism is found only in fulfillment, a consumption which is replenishing, growth, and renewal of mind and body. Harmony of social interests is found in the worldwide sharing of activities significant in themselves, that is to say, at the point of consumption. Footnote 9. Acknowledgment is due The Social Interpretation of History by Maurice Williams. End of footnote. But the forcing of production, apart from consumption, leads to the monstrous belief that class struggle, civil war, is a means of social progress, instead of a register of the barriers to its attainment. Yet here too the Marxian reads aright the character of most current economic activity. The history of economic activity thus exemplifies the moral consequences of the separation of present activity and future ends from each other. It also embodies the difficulty of the problem, the tax placed by it upon thought and goodwill. For the professed idealists and the hard-headed materialist or practical man have conspired together to sustain this situation. The idealist sets up as the ideal not fullness of meaning of the present, but a remote goal. Hence the present is evacuated of meaning. It is reduced to being a mere external instrument, an evil necessity due to the distance between us and significant, valid satisfaction. Appreciation, joy, and peace in present activity are suspect. They are regarded as diversions, temptations, and unworthy relaxations. Then, since human nature must have present realization, a sentimental, romantic enjoyment of the ideal becomes a substitute for intelligent and rewarding activity. The utopia cannot be realized in fact, but it may be appropriated in fantasy and serve as an anodyne to blunt the sense of a misery which after all endures. Some private key to a present entering upon remote and superior bliss is sought, just as the evangelical enjoys a complacent and superior sense of a salvation unobtained by fellow mortals. Thus the normal demand for realization, for satisfaction in the present, is abnormally met. Meantime, the practical man wants something definite, tangible, and presumably obtainable for which to work. He is looking after a good thing, as the average man is looking after a good time, that natural caricature of an intrinsically significant activity. Yet his activity is impractical. He is looking for satisfaction somewhere else than where it can be found. In his utopian search for a future good, he neglects the only place where good can be found. He empties present activity of meaning by making it a mere instrumentality. When the future arrives, it is only, after all, another despised present. By habit, as well as by definition, it is still a means to something which has yet to come. Again, human nature must have its claims satisfied, and sensuality is the inevitable recourse. Usually a compromise is worked out by which a man for his working hours accepts the philosophy of activity for some future result, while at odd leisure times he enters, by conventionally recognized channels, upon an enjoyment of spiritual blessings and ideal refinements. The problem of serving God and mammon is thus solved. The situation exemplifies the concrete meaning of the separation of means and ends, which is the intellectual reflex of the divorce of theory and practice, intelligence and habit, and foresight and present impulse. Moralists have spent time and energy in showing what happens when appetite and impulse is indulged without reference to consequences and reason. But they have mostly ignored the counterpart evils of an intelligence that conceives ideals and goods which do not enter into present impulse and habit. The life of reason has been specialized, romanticized, or made a heavy burden. This situation embodies the import of the problem of actualizing the place of intelligence in conduct. Our whole account of the place of intelligence in conduct is exposed, however, to the charge of being itself romantic, a compensatory idealization. The history of mind is a record of intellect which registers with more or less inaccuracy what has happened after it has happened. The crisis in which the intervention of foreseeing and directing mind is needed passes unnoted, with attention directed toward incidentals and irrelevancies. The work of intellect is post mortem. The rise of social science, it will be pointed out, has increased the amount of registering that occurs. Social post-mortems occur much more frequently than they used to. But one of the things which the unbiased mind will register is the impotency of discussion, analysis, and reporting in modifying the course of events. The latter goes its way unheeding. The reply that this condition of matters shows not the impotency of intelligence, but that what it passes for science is not science, is too easy a retort to be satisfactory. We must have recourse to some concrete facts, or surrender our doctrine just at the moment when we have formulated it. Technical affairs give evidence that the work of inquiry, reporting, and analysis is not always ineffectual. The development of a chain of nationwide tobacco shops, of a well-managed national telephone system, of the extension of the service of an electric light plant testify to the fact that study, reflection, and the formation of plans do, in some instances, determine a course of events. The effect is seen in both engineering management and in national commercial expansion. Such potency, however, it must be admitted, is limited to just those matters that are called technical, in contrast with the larger affairs of humanity. But if we seek, as we should, for a definition of technical, we can hardly find any save one that goes in a circle. Affairs are technical in which observation, analysis, and intellectual organization are determining factors. Is the conclusion to be drawn that a conviction that our wider social interests are so different from those in which intelligence is a directing factor, that in the former science must always remain a belated visitor coming upon the scene after matters are settled? No. The logical conclusion is that as yet we have no technique in important economic, political, and international affairs. Complexity of conditions render the difficulties in the way of the development of a technique enormous. It is imaginable they will never be overcome. But our choice is between the development of a technique by which intelligence will become an intervening partner and a continuation of a regime of accident, waste, and distress. End of Part 3, Section 9, The Present and Future. End of Human Nature and Conduct, Part 3, by John Dewey.